All right, it is my pleasure to call to order the meeting of the Freeport Planning Board. It is Wednesday, June 1st. It is after 6 p.m. We're coming off a workshop. Apologize for the delay. Item number 1, as always, is an information exchange. Caroline, would you please update us on review of, with a review of items reviewed by the Project Review Board?
Sure. So the Project Review Board, I would say we're seeing a little slowdown in the number of agenda items coming before them. Still a lot of design review. They reviewed the preliminary plans for the Harris Secret Ridge subdivision. That's 80 units on US Route 1 North in one of the MD zones. It's 40 duplex structures with 80 total units. They tabled the preliminary review. The applicant will be coming back at some point. Also, in the last month, they reviewed some signage for the Freeport Historical Society and on Main Street. They're adding some signs and doing some replacement. And they also did a design review certificate for Night Hot Kitchen. They added, in Freeport Crossing, the Shaw's Plaza where Mass Landing is, they're next to that. They added a pergola and some outdoor seating. So they had to come to the board for approval for that. They also reviewed a minor subdivision amendment, a note on a plan regarding lot coverage that had to come back to the board. That is all that they have reviewed, and I just want a quick follow-up under info exchange. If the board is excited with all the legal information they heard tonight, but they still have questions or want additional follow-up, I think once we get through summer, we could schedule a follow-up with the town attorney. It was scheduling-wise and vacations and all that, it was hard to get 2 separate meetings. So we did put it into one. I know you learned a little bit more about both boards than normal, but I wanted to make sure we got some of the basics with so many new board members. So just let me know at some point if you have additional questions and it warrants a separate workshop, because I'll be happy to schedule that for you. And then Sam, I don't know if you want to, we can do it later, the downtown stuff, or you can do it now.
Yeah, why don't we do it maybe between items 4 and 5? Would that be a good time?
Or probably under non-agenda items, maybe, on number 7?
Sure.
Do it down there?
Yeah, we can do that. That makes sense. Item number 2 is approval of minutes from the December 1st, 2021 Planning Board meeting. 4 of us, I believe, would be the quorum that would approve these minutes. Any questions, comments, concerns? Do I hear a motion to approve?
Motion to approve?
And a second?
Second.
All in favor? Excellent.
Was that one recusal by Mitch? Is that correct? Because he wasn't here?
I wasn't
Mitch
here.
and Andrew both
Okay.
recused.
It's approving the December meeting.
December meeting, yes, please,
Yep.
yes.
Yep. So, passed by a small quorum. All right, item number 3 is a proposed amendments to section 201.c.1, non-conforming buildings of the Freeport zoning ordinance. This will be a public hearing to discuss possible amendments to section 201.c.1 of the Freeport zoning ordinance to consider a text change to allow an expansion of existing non-conforming buildings if the non-conformance with regard to the space standards of the applicable zoning district, that is, does not increase riveting stuff. As a reminder, I will be recusing myself from this because I live in an existing non-conforming building and I have a pending project
And I
that may be
can't
affected by this.
remember, are you guys down a vice chair, so you need to elect someone to take over?
That's how we did
were
it
you on
last time.
phone?
I believe
Okay.
Andrew
Andrew.
last time took over the chair position. So without further ado, I will recuse myself and join the public.
And are you guys going to agree to have Andrew again? Somebody needs to lead the conversation, so take over as chair.
Be a temporary chair.
Are you willing to do so, Andrew? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah?
No objections. So,
Well, somebody else wants to.
No, go ahead.
So we need to open the public hearing, correct?
yep, do you want us walk through the language and a summary first of what you have before you, or want to do hearing first? You're in charge.
What's the pleasure of the board? Want to walk through the
I would
language?
like to ask a
Language.
question about the language before we have a public hearing.
if that's okay?
Yeah, so why don't I walk through it, because we talked about it at the last meeting, and then you guys can ask questions of me.
Do we need to open a public hearing before we do that?
No, we
Not-
can have, we'll open the public hearing after.
Okay, let's go for
You
it.
guys don't need a public hearing to
Yep.
deliberate. So we talked about this at the last meeting, how, years ago when our code officer started, he flagged the issue of, why doesn't Freeport let someone with a non-conforming structure add on outside of the shoreline zone? We get requests from people that have a house that might not meet setbacks. It could actually be any of the space standards. So they could have a lot that has too much impervious area, or they could have a building that's too high. But they haven't been able to add on unless they go to the Board of Appeals for a variance, and in which case, if that was granted, they would still be limited to a 15% one-time expansion. We talked at the last meeting how in the shoreline,
Could I ask a question right there on how?
you can.
How it sits today? Mm-hmm. And so, but if somebody did want to add on under the current law, and they were not adding on to not to the non-conforming area, and they weren't going higher than was allowed, or they would still need to go to a variance?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay, so right now, and we'll walk through the variance options so you understand. So right now, if you're not in the shoreline zone, not within that 250 feet of the protected resource, if you don't conform to one of those standards and you want to add on to a portion that still wouldn't meet the standards, which I'll clarify that more, you'd have to go to the Board of Appeals. In the shoreline zone, you can just do it. So we have the standard, but not outside of the shoreline zone. So if you have a house that doesn't meet the setback, let's just say the required setback in the rural zone is 50 feet, your house predates zoning, it's only 10 feet from the property line, you have a couple of options. You do have the right to add on to that. It doesn't have to be a house, but you have the right to add on to that structure if you can meet today's setbacks. So for example, if the edge of your house is here 10 feet, you could add on here if you meet that full 50 feet setback.
Without a
which-
variance?
Right,
Right,
yep,
okay.
by right.
So you just, if you want to increase the non-conforming?
That would not increase the non-conforming, because the portion you're
Correct,
adding,
correct.
yep, would meet
Yep.
the setback. You wouldn't be able to square it off, I guess is a good way to look at it.
Yep.
Yep, but you could add on and meet the setbacks.
Okay.
You have two other options. Most of you were here, we just updated the Board of Appeals language to comply with the state law. State law says what the Board of Appeals can grant variances for. So there's three options. One is a hardship determination, and so that would be for any uses that are not single-family primary residential, which you have a series of hardship criteria to meet, the hardest being that essentially you have no other use of that property. Very hard tests to meet. The state guidance has basically been if you can use your property in any way, then you don't have a hardship. So they really aren't granted. Years ago, back in the day, they used to be granted, but current practice is that they're not, because that strict hardship is hard to meet. We do have that new provision for disability structure permit. So if you have somebody, let's say their house is too close to the property line, but they need an accessible ramp to be able to access, our code officer can issue the permit. The third variance option, which we have today, which again would make application and have to go to Board of Appeals, would have to meet some hardship criteria, but it's not as strict. It's not that you have no other use of the property. There's another 5 set of standards. But if you want a setback reduction or a coverage reduction, if you want to go greater than 20%, so if the setback's 50 feet, you could apply to go to 40 feet. If you want to go beyond that, and again, this is single-family primary residential dwelling, we're not talking accessory structures, and we're not talking ADUs, we're not talking duplexes. Your primary year-round residence house, if you want to apply and go lower than that, you would have to get the sign-off from your abutters that would be impacted. Again, can't do it by right. There's a variance process, application, board, survey, elevations, a bunch of materials, but there is an option. What you have before you and what we talked about at the last meeting is some language that would allow someone who has a non-conforming structure Typically, we see it for setbacks. Sometimes you would see it for lot coverage. If you're in a zone that says you can only cover 80% of the lot, you know, they could shift it essentially if they don't cover any more than 80, if you want to take down your shed and do a small addition, if that makes sense. Or if you had a building that didn't meet the height requirement, say it was too high and you wanted to square it off on the top and not go higher. That's what you have before you today. It would give people that right to expand but not increase the nonconformity, meaning they couldn't go higher, they couldn't increase the coverage, or they couldn't go any closer to the setback than they are today. They could expand horizontally or vertically if they can meet all of the other standards in the ordinance. You know, what
ahead,
question?
go ahead.
We
No,
had,
wait.
yeah, we had an internal conversation about it. You know, I think when we first talked about it, one way to look at it was like, this might enable some people to be able to add on to their existing dwelling and stay in their home, you know, with the housing costs being the way they are. If somebody can add on and do addition without having to go to a Board of Appeals or something like that. Based upon your feedback at the last meeting, this is written to apply to any structure outside of the shoreline, one family, two family, multifamily. You know, we also had the point that somebody else in the office made that this ability to add on could make people think, oh, I'm gonna buy that small house and just put on this big expansion, go way back and make these mansions. The other thing is, if you go up a story, you might not mind that your neighbor doesn't meet the setbacks, but if you go up, some people would have the philosophy, I don't want my neighbor looking in my backyard. All possible options and different ways to look at the scenario. So the language before you is based upon your feedback last month, but happy to answer any questions and we can walk through, and if you feel differently this month, then we could look at making changes as well.
I have another question about the new language proposed. So it says, if such expansion does not increase the nonconformity. So I'm trying to understand how, if you have a one-story that's too close, and then you make it a two-story that's too close, wouldn't that increase the nonconformity? And similarly, if it's 10 feet too close over here, and then you take that 10 feet that's too close and go farther, doesn't that increase the nonconformity?
I think the best way to look at it is you have to break it down. What's the nonconformity? So in that case, the nonconformity is the setback. You're still 10 feet. You're going up or you're going back, but you're still 10 feet. That 10 feet is the nonconformity. This is saying you can't go down to 9 feet. You're stuck at 10 feet, but you're right, you can go up
But if a house
and
is.
you can go back.
If the house is 10 feet, all of a sudden it could be 10 feet all the way this way, it could be 3 stories high that way.
Yep.
On that nonconformity. That's what this says.
There are people in Freeport, I can think of, this will help, you know, we get inquiries, you know, I would say more in areas with the smaller lots, not always the case. Sometimes you have these big old homesteads, they might have 40 acres, but they put the house right up there on the corner near the road. Some of those situations, you know, I think we have some older subdivisions, and subdivisions can be complicated. Sometimes they have their own setbacks and own restrictions, but you know, we have some parts of Freeport that might have these acre lots because they were approved under old standards. Today they have a 2.5 acre, and they can't add on unless they go through the process of going to the Board of Appeals and meeting that hardship criteria.
Oh, so even if then they couldn't do anything.
We do have, yes, we
Yeah.
have areas where, you know, people have non-conforming lots.
The problem
Which
is
side
just,
to that
let's
fix
just
the
say they
zoning?
met all the other criteria. They met height restrictions and lot coverage and setbacks. But the very fact that they lived on a lot that no longer is permitted in that zone, they couldn't add anything.
Not today, not without going to the Board of Appeals, and they'd be stuck at that 15%. If they don't
And
meet
they
the
would have to meet the
setbacks.
and they'd have to prove something.
The hardship, yep.
No. I'm ready for a public hearing. I'm not sure
I guess I have one question is, I keep coming back to this is already, they're already doing it in the shoreline zone. Have you seen applicants who, you know, they're buying up, like the concern that was brought up in the office of they're buying small homes and making McMansions? Has that come to fruition?
You know, when I first started here, years and years ago, in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of people coming in and doing that on the water, but they were doing it by going to the Board of Appeals. I'm not sure if we had this, maybe we got this current provision in '09 or sometime when we updated shoreline, but back in the day, we saw a lot of that. It was typically on the water in the coastal parts. But, you know, there's been people, like I said, in old subdivisions or, you know, South Street or some of the areas where we have smaller lots, they have old homes, they don't conform, and they were more, I would say, modest. But back in the day, we did see people taking down houses to go bigger. That, we generally haven't seen that trend, but, you know, the economy can change. If building prices go down, we could see that. The market's very different now than it was 20 years ago. And I think you do have people here tonight that would comment if you.
Any other questions from the board? Think we ought to move to open the public hearing? Get a second?
Second.
Who moved that?
I did.
Someone other than the chair needs to
Oh.
move it?
You.
So moved.
Second. There we go.
Anna Wayne, okay. And did you vote to open it?
We will vote. All in favor? Think we ought to open the public hearing? Anybody from the public want to speak first? Step up to the podium.
You saw me last month, so I'm saying the same thing. My name is Louisa Picard. I live at 43 Bow Street, and I'm in the predicament where I went in 2002 and got the extra property line that I needed, but when I went to try to do the project this year, I was 4.5 inches off. So I'm in the same situation that the way it's written is making it difficult for me to go up. I would have to go to the Board of Appeals again for the same thing that I went through in 2002. So I am very close to my neighbor, but I've spoken with her beforehand, and she's fine with it. And if it's a matter of having a letter, I have no problem asking her for that, and any one of my neighbors. My house is 1 story, and in front of me is a 3-story house. To the right is a 3-story, and to the left is a 3-story. So I feel like a little bus in the big city. But this would help me very much, and I'm sure other people as well. Any questions for me?
Have you reviewed the language?
Well, I was here the last
Reviewed
meeting.
what is up for hearing tonight?
Yeah, and I think I'd be all right. Caroline?
This language would help this situation as written. But again, we're talking all of Freeport too.
Right.
So, I have a question, but maybe I should wait.
Okay, yep, finish taking public comment.
I'll just wait.
Unless you have a comment or a question for the
Yeah.
commenter. Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Sam Kapala. I live at 198 Main Street in Freeport, and I also live in an existing non-conforming building. And we would like to expand slightly back. The house is kind of set at an angle to the property line, and there's one point. Our side setback, I believe, is 10 feet, and there's one point that's, I don't know, maybe 6 feet from the property line, and it kind of tapers back. And we would like, and then, you know, just to square off and continue the house, we would still be inside the setback. You know, we'd like to, for a few different reasons, expand, not increasing the nonconformity, but obviously expand the house. And it would be, I think, fair to allow us to do that, given that it is allowable inside the shoreland zone. So I don't think we'd be doing any harm with that expansion. It would streamline the process for us and allow us to make better use of our home for the family. So I am
That
in
includes-
favor.
The proposal, your proposal would include adding on at that 6-foot point?
It would
Just
be,
going back.
yeah, we're going back, so kind of a different situation than the other commenter. So we would be going back within the existing setback.
But then that wouldn't really apply to didn't you just say if you have a non-conforming house, but what you want to add on has nothing to do with the non-conforming?
But it does.
It does, he doesn't meet that.
I don't meet the
10-foot
setback.
He's at 6, so whether he wants to go horizontal or vertical.
So you're gonna carry the 6 foot back to the line.
Are you carrying the
Roughly
6 foot-
speaking,
You're making
yeah,
the
yeah.
6, you're continuing on the 6-foot line.
No part of the new expansion would be closer to the line than the existing house.
But it
Yes.
would be closer to the line than 10 feet.
Yes.
Correct,
Okay.
He doesn't conform right now.
right.
No, I get that. I was just trying to figure out is the,
So I think it brings up a really good point, because I also struggled to understand what exactly, and I think it is a little bit unclear, what is increasing nonconformity? Like, are you increasing the volume of the house that is nonconforming? Or are you, because that would be one way to potentially interpret increasing. No, I know it's not the way it's interpreted, but it is hard to understand. So it's a separate conversation, but I think it's
So you're
in,
saying as an applicant, reading through this,
reading through it, I think it
trying
would.
to figure out, it's hard to discern what's the nonconformity. Is it volume, or is it setback, or is it?
Or is it,
both?
yes, right, so if you define the nonconformity as like the point at which, or like I don't even know how to say it, a unit of nonconformity, like if say my house is 3 feet at the closest, that is the nonconformity. So I can have as much of the house as I want at 3 feet, and it's not increasing the nonconformity because I'm not closer than 3 feet. So that's the way, but the wording can be confusing, that's all I'm saying, so.
Despite the confusion, are you suggesting that if we pass this amendment as written, this satisfies your?
Absolutely, yep, separate, the confusion is an entirely separate issue, I support this as written. I will also say, I would, I'll leave it there, it's great.
You think you think we should change this language somehow to make it less confusing?
I'm not sure there's an opportunity to do that, in that I would probably defer to Caroline.
I think you have a couple things. So, we talked at the last meeting, 2 things. Right now, this would apply to everything. It could apply to commercial, it could apply to residential, 1 unit, 2 unit. That's how this is written. I think we never want to adopt language that's not clear. A couple people have said to me, Mitch didn't think it was clear and Sam didn't think it was clear. 2 educated people in the room are reading it and it's not clear. The nonconformity would be the space requirements, which are in our ordinance, like a setback, it could be lot coverage, or it could be height. I think if you wanted to look at,
Does not add it does not add a new nonconformity, because it is increasing the nonconformity, in my mind, if you have a 1-story and make it a 2-story, but you're not adding a new nonconformity. You had this one nonconformity, but you haven't added another one.
I wonder if is there a way to define what an increase of nonconformity is and add that definition to the zoning ordinance somewhere?
I need to look, it would warrant a little bit more digging, not on the fly. So
Right,
it says now, if the structure may be added to or expanded vertically or horizontally after obtaining a permit from the codes enforcement officer, if such expansion does not increase the nonconformity of the existing structures or create a new nonconformity. It is pretty standard language that
Right,
we
'cause
use
it's
in
been-
Shoreland and we
yeah.
have from other municipalities.
right, there is precedent for interpreting it in this way. So I'm not suggesting we reinvent the wheel on this tonight. I think it's just an interesting
You
point.
do also have somebody on Zoom. I don't know if they want to comment on this or not.
What do we ask?
You wanna-
Room want to comment?
Who's on?
So
Can you punch up Zoom?
Zoom's up. Aaron, if you wish to comment on this item, please raise your virtual hand and the board will take comment from you. No hands
A
being
little hand
raised.
up over there? What's that little thing right over there by June?
No, that's,
If Aaron wanted to comment, there'd be a little yellow hand up there.
Okay. Anybody else?
I have more comments and questions for the board. I mean, so my concern about this is that you could, I can imagine all sorts of situations where a non-conforming property gets worse in the nonconformity to the detriment of the neighbors. And so I wrote down 3 questions. One has to do with the appeals board. And there's no way to change the, so you were reading me something about a state statute, that first one, and it says that, I'm trying to figure out why a variance couldn't, it would seem to me if you're doing something that's on a non-conforming property, you would need a variance. That just seems basic, that you would want to have a review of what's going on and not automatically make a structure that's too close to the property line significantly bigger. Because in the case of 4 inches, it seems immaterial. I think in your case, it's against the street. I'm not sure if it's against the neighbor or a street. But anyway, in the state law, it asks for it sets 2 standards. Does it hurt, something about, does it hurt anybody? You gave me 2 words. One was the neighbor's approval, and if they're affected, and there was another one about whether it was a materiality question. And both of those seem like good reasons for variances. You know, it seemed to me variances shouldn't be unreasonably withheld, but I think the standard of variance is hardship, and in which case you could never do it. So, I mean, I don't like this answer, and I don't like the current answer. The current answer, you know? I'm just worried about every house all of a sudden that's too close to the property line becoming enormous.
The variance language for Board of Appeals under 601, we just updated the past couple months, and it's directly out of state law, and so we have to meet the minimum. So we don't have the flexibility. The burden of proof is always on the applicant. In the case of, you know, the people that commented tonight for a single-family home, let me quote you what there's, so for setback variance for a one-family dwelling, the other variances would have to meet that strict test of hardship. And when it's their primary residence, their standards are the need for the variance is due to the unique circumstances of the property and not the general conditions of the neighborhood. Granting the
Wait,
variance.
could you say that again? The unique conditions of the property, it's
Unique circumstances of the property
4 inches.
and not the general conditions of the neighborhood.
oh, okay.
Don't make a verbal decision because it would really be up to 7 people.
Yeah.
The granting of the variance will not alter the essential character of the locality. The hardship is not the result of action taken by the applicant or the prior owner. The granting of the variance will not substantially reduce or impair the use of the abutting property. That the granting of a variance is based upon a demonstrated need, not convenience, and no other feasible alternative exists. And then there's a requirement if you want to go greater than 20% of what the requirement, you'd have to get the sign off from the neighbor. So those standards, just like certain things are reviewed by project review, the Board of Appeals, 7 appointed members, would be responsible to review the materials submitted by the applicant to determine if those 5 standards have been met. And if they want greater than the 20% reduction in the setback, then they would need, or the height, whatever it may be, they would need to get sign off from the, let me give you the right word, written consent of an affected abutting landowner.
Do we have any kind of estimate about how many non-conforming structures there are in the town?
No, we really wouldn't have a good way to do that unless we took all 4,500 parcels and basically Google Earth measured them.
I bet there's quite a few, because a lot of stuff was built in the 50s.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff was built turn of the century. I ran into this on Route 1 years ago. We had a 100-foot setback, 50% lot ratio coverage, and the ordinance said no variance. And I wrote to Fred, I said, can I expand internally if I wanted to put a new cellar in? And he said, no, I can't grant you. You can't expand anywhere, even internally. And of course, the law got changed after a while. The zoning on Route 1 got changed, By the time I was the code officer, I could have appealed it, I wasn't gonna, I just wanted to test to see what the action was, and I was denied.
I mean, I think, we have zoning for a reason. It reflects the values of the community, and what we've identified in our comp plan. I do think there's some cases that, if there's a large area where we have these smaller lots, I think the best practice would be to look at the zoning and fix the problem. But that isn't always the case, because you do have these houses that were built, 100 years ago, and they don't fit into what's around them, and they are gonna be a unique situation. But the variance, I think, is kind of a last resort. You shouldn't be giving them out all the time, because we do have standards, but it makes it tough for existing homes.
And how far off does this now mimic our shoreline zoning, this new language? You've added in red?
It's a very little bit different wording, just because I tried to fit it into the existing, but
see.
same
idea.
objective.
So
Yeah.
it's almost a fairness issue, if they can do it down the shoreline zone, which is more sensitive than,
Well,
Route 125 or something, I mean.
Most of the shoreland would be, there's some exceptions, most of that is residential. Now, this would be residential, commercial, all different uses.
I mean, that's what I was thinking, like, I think we could all agree, if you have it in the shoreline zone, it's not just to not give anything in other areas of Freeport, but is there a way to make it so we're all concerned about, all of a sudden, everyone's just gonna be building up high? Could we make it to be just residential, or to put some sort of limit on it, so?
You could put limits on it. I did look around at other municipalities based upon your feedback at the last meeting. This, closest mirrors Topsom. They have language like this, like we do in the shoreline. There's some communities that allow you to get under a certain distance. Some towns require a Board of Appeals at a certain point, but again, then you still get into that whole variance situation. I think it was Falmouth had like a special provision for a single family. So I definitely think there's different things. If you don't feel like this is accomplishing or achieving what you want it to, we can take another stab at it. We had standard notification, we have agendas, we did a public hearing ad, but it didn't have to mail 3,000 notices like we had for some other stuff. So if you want to take another stab, or you feel like we need to look at defining, increasing a nonconformity, or you want to look at specific uses, you could table it and we could do that.
Sam, you got a?
Yeah, I had a quick comment. So, I mean, I think the language, there is a key difference here, because this language eliminates the 15% limit on expansion, right, Caroline? So there is no, as long as you're not increasing nonconformity, you can basically.
But then you run into a lot coverage
Yes,
ratio.
exactly. You run into lot coverage and.
And other setback issues.
And setbacks and building height.
If you have a commercial, you
right.
have parking issues. And
Yes, so there are, but I think as a homeowner who's considering a project of this sort, I would not be, and as a member of the community, obviously, I would not be opposed to, some limit on it. Maybe, not all commercial buildings, or not, putting some limits on it. I think in the case of the sort of at a level approach, I think if we restricted, and when I say we, I mean you, because obviously I'm over here, but I think thinking about the at a level, that would be highly restrictive to somebody who's trying to go up if you limited it to 15% of the floor area. So that would be challenging. And I think, I guess I'm not as concerned about like lots of people suddenly expanding their homes, given that there are lots of other standards in place. However, I'm not totally, opposed to some restrictions either. That's my 2 cents as a member of the public.
Can I ask another question about why is it, what was the logic that made it permissible in the shoreline zoning?
I think
'Cause
it's,
I agree with what you said about it. It seems kind of weird to
yeah,
allow it in
Mike,
one place.
it's allowed under shoreline zoning. My guess is when we updated it at some point, we carried it into our ordinance, the non-conforming section of our zoning ordinance has kind of been a mess. We've been doing cleanup as we took the shoreland out. My guess is in the 2000s, it probably got added in there for shoreland because the state allowed it in their minimum guidelines and Freeport chose to adopt it.
And of course, the shorelands, Freeport, you know, there was a lot of subdivisions along the shore, and they were small lots.
Yep.
You'd buy 1, 2, 3, 50-foot lots.
Oh, yeah.
So you ended up with basically summer camps that all of a sudden became valuable, and somebody wanted to live there year-round.
Yeah.
So,
And they did do it. I mean, I know
Oh, yeah.
shoreline properties where they did that
yeah,
exact.
yeah. But, you know, at some point, and
Yeah, and I think, that,
I mean, you have to not be fear of the future either. I mean, you know, it was just camps down there once upon a time, now there are houses. So, you know, I'm not so afraid to let something happen. Because now, how does this affect somebody that's been through site plan review? I mean, a lot of the commercial buildings, we talked about commercial buildings, there are probably, what, a dozen maybe old commercial buildings that are,
I think that's gonna be a little bit tougher, you know, a lot
yeah,
of,
because
like,
we
if-
worry about a commercial building, but most of the new commercial buildings in Freeport have been through site plan review of some sort.
Right, and like, you might have something non-conforming in the village, but if they wanna add on or do something to the building, they have design review. So you have those other standards that you do need to meet,
Yeah.
that are still in place. I would say, like, when we brought this forward again, the code officer was something that he flagged, but from the staff perspective, it's more, you know, we have homeowners, like, you know, the lady that wants to add a second story, or we've had, I remember this one guy wanted to add like this teeny tiny dormer just to fit a bathroom, and he had to get a survey and go to Board of Appeals and get elevations, and he's like, what, my building is already there, like the other 2 stories, you're telling me I can't dormer there, so I'm like, yep, I'm telling you, you can't dormer it, like, it's interesting, people look at it different ways, you know, and how they read it, and what's that nonconformity. A lot of times people will come in and they just assume because like they have one story, like, why can't I go up? And they're quite surprised to learn that they can't. There are other residential people that have inquired over the years, you know, they don't want to go through the whole Board of Appeals that I think would take advantage of it.
Personally, I think in a lot of ways this makes sense, because I think it allows existing housing stock to be modified to a modern use or a modern way of living. You know, might want to put just like this fellow probably wanted to put a bathroom on the 2nd floor where there was never one before. Or, you know, they'll come to town and buy a house that, you know, then they can fix it up and add value to the house and you know, add to the community. I mean, I just think I'm in support of anything that sort of helps people keep existing stock or modify existing stock or.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, seems very much in line with the Freeport Comprehensive Plan in that it's making homes more livable. It's keeping families in Freeport, you know, the modern family who might need more room for a growing child. You know, when I hear something like, oh, but then everyone's just gonna expand and make McMansions, I get fearful. I think Sam brought up a good point that, you know, these are why we have these checks and balances of other standards.
Well, but what would be the check and balance in the, I'm only concerned about, you know, what we might be not realizing
Sure,
we're allowed.
absolutely. Yeah, I hear you. And that's what we're gonna say.
And so, yeah, so how could you, what would be the check and balance on, it seems to me so site-specific, you know, is it, that's why I like the language that was in the state about, did it alter the?
The
Did
variance.
it all, there was a qualitative thing about, did it matter? And then most of the time, it probably wouldn't matter, but some of the time it would, but I don't know how we could write a thing that wouldn't get us in trouble.
Well,
What,
if your-
what,
if your
what
neighbor
exactly are you
doesn't like
concerned
you-
about? Commercial, residential, the downtown, or all over town, or?
I think 2 things I want to add. I have an idea for you. So Anna made a good point. She made a point of like people that want to stay in their house. Within the past year, maybe 2, time's just going by at a weird pace, the planning board made an amendment to our Village Commercial 1, the downtown, because homes were non-conforming. And we have some very small modest house on small lots that people couldn't expand unless they had this provision. And so we had a family that it wasn't an option for them to stay in their house with a growing family. So the board made the houses non-conforming so that they would have the ability to add on. I think one thing we've talked a lot about in the past year, checks and balances. You know, in the past, the planning board has made these standards and then they go on and we don't revisit them. We've talked about the need to revisit certain standards, like food trucks. We changed a standard and we said, okay, in a year, we're gonna look and see, did it work, didn't it work? Let's get some feedback. And, you know, this is something I think maybe the right thing is to monitor it. I mean, you could have some stuff happen. Anytime you have a new standard, stuff can happen that you don't realize that you could not like. But in a year, we could revisit it, track the permits and see who and what took advantage of them. If it's not being utilized, how it's adopted to reflect the comp plan, then I think you need to revisit it. That's one check and balance, which we've talked about for a lot of other things. But there could be something come in that, you know, you don't like during that time period.
Yeah, but I think we have to, I mean, just personally, I think we have to be able to sort of take that leap of faith
Yeah.
to, you know, I mean, I keep looking at Freeport. I grew up here. I see how much it changed downtown, and it'll change again. And we have to allow it to change, and you have to accept a little good with the bad sometimes, and just, like Carolyn says, just learn from it. If we have a couple of bad experiences, just look at it in a couple of years and say, okay, you know, is that a bad deal, or is the percentage small enough so, okay, 2 or 3 got by and we don't like them, but sort of in a free society, well, you know, is it the worst thing in the world? Or how many people did we help compared to a couple ugly buildings?
Or do we need more restrictions on it?
That's
based
right,
on what
yeah,
happened?
yeah.
And
So,
Anna made the good point. Any recommendation you guys make to the zoning ordinance, you have to make a motion of how it's in general harmony with the comp plan. So do you feel like, Anna summarized, this meets our goals and objectives of the comp plan for affordable housing, or remaining family-friendly, or whatever one of the many things it may be? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you choose to take action, that's the recommendation.
now, this would also sort of dovetail in with this new thing coming down from the state with the accessory buildings. So a lot of these buildings downtown, or a lot of buildings, just, you know, somebody'd like to add on an accessory apartment to help, so they can stay in their home, pay the taxes, whatever, and they're in a downtown lot, or they're just too, you know, they're not increasing the nonconformity, but they don't quite meet the setback. You know, and they want to take the back half of the house and add something on. I think this fits in with that as well. I think it would facilitate that at some level.
You could, again, we haven't seen the full implications to that and how it's going to impact Freeport.
Yeah.
But you could see an increase in building of people wanting to add this space or square off so that they could potentially, even today, they could fit an accessory dwelling unit, but you could see more people wanting to do that.
Now, does Freeport, I mean, not to drag this out to accessory dwellings, but I think it fits this. Does Freeport still have a distance restriction from the initial dwelling? It used to be 50 feet.
I can't remember if we still have it or if we reduced it. We changed it since the original, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to
Does the
look
new,
at it.
have we seen the new state law to see if there's a distance restriction?
The state law was changed at the last minute. I've looked at it, but we really need to go in and dissect it. I do think we are gonna have to change some of our accessory dwelling standards. I think overall, like, we have a really good start. We're in pretty good shape, but we'll have to tweak some of that. Did anyone close the public hearing, or are you
Oh,
still?
not yet. I think we're still, does anybody more from the public want to speak? Nobody? Nobody? Sam? Nobody? I think we need to,
I move we close the public hearing.
Second?
so moved? All in favor? Motion to close the public hearing passed. So do we want to, any more discussion at the board? We want to vote to read a motion to approve this?
I'll say if you guys want to approve it, I forgot to draft you a motion, so somebody's gonna need to make one on the fly. Looking at you, Anna. And make that finding of how you think it's consistent with the current comprehensive plan.
Okay.
I'm not saying you have to do it, Anna, but you were rattling stuff
Go-
off.
go ahead. I will give it a stab. All right.
Well, I'll look at you while you come up with something.
Okay.
So I think if you wanted to make a motion, you could do something like, be it ordered that the Freeport Planning Board recommend to the Freeport Town Council the adoption of proposed amendments to Section 202 of the Freeport zoning ordinance as presented at the June 1, 2022 meeting, finding that it's in general harmony with the comp plan, whatever you want to insert. And then if somebody wants to amend it, you can amend the motion or amend the language, whatever you want to do from there.
Okay. All right, I will give it a try. So be it ordered that the Freeport Planning Board make a recommendation to the town council to adopt the language of the Freeport zoning ordinance to consider a text change to allow an expansion of an existing non-conforming building if the non-conformance with regards to the space standards does not increase. And the language was presented at the June 1st, 2022 Planning Board meeting. And that it is in harmony with the Freeport Comprehensive Plan of making Freeport a livable community for growing families and an affordable residential place. How's that?
Second?
Do we mention that we'll review this in a
Oh,
few
yeah.
years?
We will review this in 1 year's time and see what applications have come before the town, to see if any amendments need to be made or restrictions.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me.
You'd have to take a vote.
All in favor?
All right,
Done.
Sam?
Sam, you can come back.
Just before we move off that, I would suggest that we look to clarify the language about increasing the nonconformity, because that is a source of, could be a source of a problem if somebody else interprets it differently than we all understand it tonight, so that probably should be changed. And it also relates to language that we're not changing under 202B, which says that provided the number of square feet of floor area devoted to the nonconforming use is not increased. That's a little bit different language than the text change we're making now, and both of those could be clarified, I think.
Okay.
You think some sort of diagram would help, a visual diagram, or?
Perhaps,
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll work with staff to craft something, and when we have something, I'll just put on agenda for discussion. That sound good?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, item number 4, continued discussion on possible uses of cannabis manufacturing and processing and cannabis cultivation.
So we talked about this at the last meeting. We talked about buffers. And so at the last meeting, we showed you a buffer map and we showed you, we gave you some information on where manufacturing and processing was located. So in regards to the buffer, you talked about wanting to add some buffers for cannabis. And so we're gonna walk through that tonight. We'll look at buffers. We want to get a little more input from you guys on where you want to potentially see, where may or may not, based upon the buffers, the cultivation and manufacturing and processing, where it could or could not be appropriate, and a few other things. So Cicely and I have both had to be out of the office a little bit, so we didn't get as far along, I think, as we had hoped, but Cecilia's gonna walk you through the map, what it shows, and then kind of flag some discussion points for additional feedback. So she's at the podium and ready to go. And you do have some members of the public still on Zoom, just so you know.
So in your packet, you have a new map that I created that has the schools, private and public. And this time it includes also childcare facilities. And I also have in the package for you the school definitions from the state for you to look at. So the state has the minimum buffer requirement of 1,000 feet from schools, public and private. And then it also includes this pretty vague addition to, say, any other educational facility that serves children from pre-kindergarten to grade 12. But that is vague, and we clarified with the attorney. It's just the state hasn't figured that one out yet. But we do include, we did include the childcare facilities. The state, not in the marijuana law, but as the state defines childcare centers, there's like several like subcategories. So it's difficult to really pinpoint and find like a source of information of where can we get information on these licenses so that we can map them out. The state DHHS has a provider database, so we included in the buffer maps the ones that are classified as childcare centers, as the ones that were classified as home are usually the small daycare facilities that the direction was to leave those out. One thing that's important to note is that under the state definitions of, both childcare centers and all the different categories in the schools, is that it does not include things like private tutoring centers for children, youth camps, after-school programs that do not fall into those state categories or state definitions of school, and also, other programs that offer instruction for children, such as dance classes, karate classes, or basketball. Like, those are not included in the state definition, and we do not include those in this. So if the town wishes to incorporate anything other than the state school or the childcare facilities definitions, we would have to add that to our own definition and be clear about it. We can, and that's what we should do if you want to include, expand upon the school definition. For instance, South Portland found out that the Boys and Girls Club did not fit into any of those categories, so they chose to add that to their definitions. So as we move forward, we're looking for direction in what the board feels are appropriate zoning districts, and also direction on what will be appropriate performance standards. So what right now, in looking at the buffers, given that the state only mandates for the schools, many towns do choose to go above and beyond what the state requires, and they'll add things that they consider sensitive uses, such as parks, churches, libraries, sometimes residential uses. Those are very commonly used. I found interesting example would be the state of Washington, what they consider sensitive uses, and that's, for the state of Washington, it is a requirement to have this 1,000 feet buffer, and that's for any elementary or secondary school, which Maine does. But then, in addition to that, they have playground, recreation center or facility, childcare center, which we would be adding, public park, public transit center or library, or any game arcade admission, which is not restricted to people under, over the age of 21. So my question to the board is, should we include any other facilities that you would consider, sensitive uses on these buffer areas? And that's, yeah.
Do you have the ability to show us on the map and name all the places that you have circled?
No. Yeah, sorry. The
Yeah,
map.
most of them.
I think
Yeah, we can give you a quick run through
Okay.
if you want. Again, just in case people are watching, the directive from the council was to only look at cannabis manufacturing, processing, cultivation. So with all this discussion, we're not talking about retail. I know you all know that. So what you have on here, out on Desert Road, you have like Maine Coast Waldorf School, formerly American Eag. This would be over out in this section near the RP. There's a little bit of yellow because they have an early child care center. In the village, you have the public schools. In here, there is a daycare, I believe, in the church on North Main Street. And then also, there's Bean Sprouts, which is a daycare on that's down here, a daycare down on Lower Main Street. We have another childcare, Goslings, on the commercial one, and then down here is the YMCA. Down in South Freeport, we have Small Steps Daycare.
First step.
Well, you have the French.
First Step.
The French
Oh, and the
school.
French
Yeah, the
school.
French
Yep,
school.
French school's picked up in here. Back going up towards Brunswick, we have another public school out in MDR. And then the couple stragglers in the rural zones, those are smaller daycares that are in-home, but like Cecilia said, the state has all these categories, but they only map them two ways, home or center. So these both picked up as, they're in-home, but they're big enough to be considered some
But they're
kind of
relevant because
center.
they're in residential zones, right?
Yeah, these are in residential
So it
zones.
doesn't matter.
There was, I think, one or two that was in-home, which we're assuming is just like a couple kids, or I think less than 12 or 13, that did not show here. Did that give you what you were looking
That's perfect, thank you.
for? And like she said, it's not going to include like places that hold karate, places that hold dance.
Summer camps.
Some summer camp places, like,
L Bean,
yeah, Ella Bean, Wolf
Snack.
Snack.
Yeah.
Lloyd, yep.
Yep, Mitch, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So, what if one of these facilities opens after, let's just say we say that you can't be within so many feet of all the childcare centers, and then a childcare center opens,
Yeah, that,
then what happens?
yeah, so usually when that happens, it's, the child care center opened, the facility was there, and the facility will stay there, so it's,
Okay.
that's usually what happens. Otherwise, it would be
legally
very,
non-conforming,
we don't want to prevent a child care center from opening, we don't want to create more barriers for that, so
Right,
that's
but you don't
how
want to
it-
force the business to move.
Right, exactly.
To somebody
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anytime someone comes in, they're gonna have to show they comply with any state requirement. So if the state says they have to be, within so far of the school, and the burden of proof is on the applicant. I think the point of showing you this tonight, or part of the point is, when you look at this, there is a good group of zones that could be entirely excluded from the buffers or the overlapping buffers, or some districts where there might be enough of it taken up by a buffer that you might be like, let's not even look at allowing it there. That's part of what this exercise did, but again, Cecilia wants a little more feedback too, if there's
So the two
Other
guys we
uses.
have now are both in the MDB zone, correct?
the two what?
The two
Oh.
two facilities we have now?
MDA, MDB, I'm not sure which is which, but yeah,
Okay.
which there's none of these facilities that require buffers up there that we were able to identify in these categories.
Are these buffers required by the state law?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
So the school one, the public and private school, is required by state. Then there's that part with the other educational facility that is vague, so perhaps not necessarily, but we're adding the childcare center as per your feedback.
I think I made a comment last time, I'll just reiterate it, that if we're going to go beyond what the state requires, we should really be identifying the harms we're trying to prevent. So,
Yep,
That's
and I
on-
can,
That's on the list of topics that she's gonna get to.
okay,
yeah. And it's all
I'll wait for that,
interlinked, yeah,
thank you.
yeah, so,
Again, we have the ability to go down to 500 feet. We hadn't really gotten into that. This is all off 1,000 feet based upon the feedback that you guys have given so far.
yeah. So, I guess I don't perhaps need an answer now, but, we will, if you have other facilities that you think should be included on that you want to create that buffer or to add to a buffer, then I'm looking for that feedback. And,
I think your question was exactly the right question. I'm trying to figure out why there's any harm.
Right, so
Yeah,
before
do-
we get to that question, I would like to hear about.
Sure.
And if there's
Yeah.
any empirical data about what the existing facilities are emitting
Right.
or whatever, that would be
So-
useful.
yes. So I didn't spend too much time looking at this. It is kind of like a research can of worms. It's difficult because marijuana is or cannabis is getting legalized throughout the country, especially for recreational purposes. And it's all very new, right? So we have these states that are starting this process. So there hasn't been enough time to really do good empirical studies. Another issue is that different states have different requirements. For instance, Vermont now allows retails, which is also very recent, I think since 2018, but, they don't allow the town to have different zoning performance standards for retail as they do for other businesses. So so every state will have different, whether they preempt zoning or not. So that makes the empirical studies a little more difficult. And then we have the problems of different types of facilities. For instance, just with cultivations, there's like different types of cultivation typologies, right? You will have indoor, outdoor, which will have different effects. Another thing that makes studying this empirically difficult is different scenarios, right? So inside a city, let's say Denver, will be very different than Freeport. So in my poking around, I did find that there were, in terms of negative impacts, these kind of two categories. One of them is environmental, which is, there's like different items to that. So air quality impacts, and one of the things would be VOCs from the plants or the solvents to process the cannabis. The other one is odor. So odor is one that really stands out as, a nuisance. But there are measures that can be taken to mitigate it if they're cultivated indoors. If they're cultivated outdoors, and that becomes a little more difficult. So another question that I would like clarification is, I had not considered outdoor cultivation, but I don't remember if that was the clear direction or not. So what does the board think?
Could I just ask clarifying?
Of course.
What you just said, the two things. So on the odor nuisance, if farming would be allowed, that might have an odor nuisance too, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be any different than spreading manure. I mean, it's a different odor.
Right.
It might be but not necessarily a stronger odor, right? I mean,
That's tricky. I lived next to a dairy farm. The odor was there, but it was not there all the time. With cultivation, you might have, the odor will be there. Of course, we're in Maine, so that will, eliminate a chunk of the year.
and on the off-gassing, aren't there standards for that? I mean, could any business that throw out CFC, whatever you're worried about, solvents into the air, I mean, aren't there other restrictions to that, environmental restrictions that have nothing to do with this?
In terms of like an EPA standard, like a general.
I mean, you said one of the concerns is that they may use solvents, and the solvents get in the air, and that creates an odor problem.
Yeah.
But what if another business of another type used those very same solvents?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why would the standards be any different for this than any other business? I mean, I could understand trying to not have solvents go in the air, but I don't know why it would be different for this type of business than another type of business.
Right, it could not be different. Yeah, so I'm just, like, generally, this is like the umbrella of negative
Yep.
effects. Another one would be like water impacts. So, you're thinking you're going to be using water, and you might be adding fertilizers or nitrogen to the plants to make them grow, and then you have to dispose of the water. So that's also recognized. That's something that, can be could have a negative environmental impact.
But other businesses would be allowed to do that? In other words, again, I'm trying to figure out why, if you could have something noxious next door to you already,
Right.
why is this more noxious?
Yep, I'm just saying it would be, considered a noxious type of use. Yeah, you could have the same issues with different types of facilities, for sure. Different agricultural uses will have similar
Or
noxious.
manufacturing or
uses.
processing?
If I could rephrase Mitch's question a little bit, why are we dealing with those things that are generally regulated? Why are we dealing with it specifically in the marijuana
Right.
statute?
Because it's a new
a
use.
different, yeah, it's a new use, so it's got its own set of standards, and I think we'll find, I mean, I think, you know,
Can we-
Cecilia is calling attention to the fact that we have these tools available to us. I think it's up to us to decide. I think, you know, there's a good point to be made. How are we regulating these things differently than other similar uses, and are we making a difference that is one of just sort of philosophy? And I think that's what we will find, is my guess, from when this comes to the public phase, is that people will come out because
They don't
it's
like
a
it.
different thing. Yeah, it's a different thing, and people feel differently about it. And I'm not, you know,
And you are gonna have some things, like I believe the state has some requirements for like odor regulation, like, so
Yep.
there are some standards that you're not gonna have a choice, they're
Right.
gonna have to do anyways, and they are regulating it
yeah.
different than other businesses, but, you know, that's a really good conversation. I guess that could lead to, you know, the next thing, you asked about some of the harms, and so the information that we can find out there on the harms is pretty high level and pretty broad. I mean, the environment's important, but, you know, we didn't find, oh, well, in Maine, this has been a proven harm to the communities. There's just
Right.
not a ton of it. Every town has like a little bit different way of regulating. They do parts of it, they don't do all of it, so it is. But, you know, when you guys look at the use, one of the other questions is, what would you got, like, what's a good starting point? We need to figure out where you want to put this. Clearly, we know areas that, if you're gonna go with that 1,000-foot buffer, I guess, do you feel that's appropriate, or do you want to push the limits and go down more? Because that's something we can pursue. And then, if you want to compare it to other uses, in your mind, are there other uses that you're like, oh, well, I think, you know, if we allow this here, we should consider allowing this use here, you know, something to compare it to, some feedback on that
Yeah,
would
I
be
mean, if-
interesting, as how you guys, you know, personally as a board member are viewing it for comparison to other uses.
I think for me, it's like, I think it's Olivia's, right, that has greenhouses out behind Pineland Farms, kind of in part of that campus. If they wanted to set up an operation growing tomatoes indoors in Freeport, how would we feel about it? You know, if they wanted to use public water supply to irrigate their crops, and if they were using fertilizer, I mean, I way out of, I don't know anything
I
about
think that's
growing indoor tomatoes,
precisely-
but you know what I mean? Like, what are the implications of allowing sort of a similar function that doesn't involve the sort of philosophical or, you know, what's the right
But
word?
if Olivia's wanted to do that today.
Right, what would they be up
Is
against?
there any rule that they would have, I mean, wouldn't they,
Yeah, they would be subject to site plan
to
review.
zoning, that there's zoning where that use is permitted?
It's a tricky comparison because Freeport, in my opinion, based upon past decisions the planning board made, is very generous when it comes to agriculture use. Like, you can do a lot of agriculture different places. But the state has said, this is not agriculture, you cannot consider it agriculture.
There's
So
a-
What do
an
they say
emotional-
you can consider it? Is it manufacturing? Is it processing?
you can consider it its own cannabis use.
Yeah,
It's its
its
own
own
special
thing.
category. You know, we have 50 other uses, but it's not gonna be agriculture, it's this own special use. And if you wanna opt in as a community to allow certain components of it, you can do it, but you have to know that we're gonna make the users do certain things, which you're gonna obviously incorporate into your ordinance.
But so right now, it isn't permitted anywhere.
Correct.
It's not permitted anywhere because it doesn't fit under any.
It's-
But these two guys are grandfathered in under, how'd they do that?
They can't, so the laws have changed a lot over the years. Back in the day, and I think we have one of them online, he can probably give you a way better history than I
Yeah.
can, but there was a provision that they could be caregivers and have a certain number of patients and go in. And so before the current state marijuana laws, they went into places that were previously manufacturing and processing.
Medical.
Past code officer at that time thought that was, you know, manufacturing, so they went in, they needed very little approval. I will say, we've gotten a couple complaints that I'm aware of, but we really haven't got complaints about either of the places. We had gotten one abutter, you know, complained about odor, but once that abutter moved, the new abutter never complained, so they've really operated pretty quietly in Freeport without a lot of complaints. I'm not aware of police calls or any of that. I mean, neither of them have big signs. You probably wouldn't even know where they were if you drove by them, to be honest. Doesn't mean they all will, but just.
Don't go
a
driving
little
by them.
bit-
Sorry, just kidding.
We learned that in the first one.
It's a law.
As a group, we
But,
can. We'll do
We
it.
can notice, we can notice and drive
So
by.
how do we move the conversation?
So I think there's a couple things. I think Cicely's put some stuff out there that, we
There's-
want feedback.
There's a couple of more to finish, to wrap up the negative environmental impact, since I want to answer your question. The other category are energy impact, so it's really high energy that goes into these facilities. It's very energy intensive, especially the indoor cultivation. So, the general saying is that, if you have facilities that rely just on the existing energy infrastructure, it will contribute to the demand and may increase the maintenance and upgrades required for these systems to operate. And finally, there's waste impacts where, the disposal of the organic plant material if it ends up on a landfill. Now, all of these environmental considerations or negative impacts, they've been generally circulated around, but I took it from, it was probably, I think, a cannabis industry paper written about how the industry needs to be more sustainable. So there are fixes for every single thing, right? So, in terms of water quality or energy, using LED lighting, it was a suggestion of best practices to make it more sustainable. But finally, and also importantly, another category of negative impact that I found out there, and it's like the town attorney pointed out, is that if you're expecting that you're going to have something that looks like a farm, that's not what it's probably going to look like. So, usually these facilities are more traditionally shaped up like a warehouse facility. There are complaints of them not being very sightly. And in terms of finding, the different study, this is a great example, which the American Planning Association just had an article on it on their planning magazine. And it was the case of Denver, where they found that they only allowed it on industrial areas that happened to be right next to, the communities of color. So what they found is that you had these prison-like facilities all concentrated on the poorest, or most
But if they're
neighborhoods.
industrial zones, I mean,
Yeah,
then
it was just,
theoretically, somebody come in and build all these industrial buildings,
Yeah.
big boxes, just the same, right?
yeah, it's just that, for example, in that community, they didn't have them before, but because it's very profitable, they popped up and kind of changed the nearby character of, the people weren't happy. I'm just pointing what was out there and what you can anticipate.
Then the answer is to change the zoning so that the industrial land isn't so close to where they live, or something like that, right? I mean, if it's already.
But it was probably already there.
Yeah.
And they just took advantage of this existing zoning.
And then zoom, yep.
I have a guy I buy some supplies from down in Biddeford. He's being booted because the grow guy there off the exit down there can overpay for the space. Yeah, so he's getting booted because his landlord says, hey, I can get more money, your lease is up. Luckily, he's found him a place across town that he owns, which is in a different zone, because they can't have cannabis there because of the setbacks. So he'll change the area, but and of course, it was a deal, you couldn't have a mortgage, because, it's against federal prohibition if you had a mortgage on the building. The guy owned the building outright, so that fit within the law. And of course, we still get down to my sticky wicket is, this is still a federally prohibited product.
That's the
So,
weirdest
we have,
part.
37 states that are, allowing it, but, and I'm sure at some point in the future, who knows how long, it will become legal everywhere in America, or it'll be declassified. And I have nothing against medical marijuana. If you can pinch something out of that and help you back, or help you with chemo, or whatever, I got no problem. But the other stuff, I still have a little resistance to, the retail end of just cannabis in general.
Yeah, well, retail's off the table because the town council.
Retail's out.
That's right, that's right.
So we are-
But that's just my personal issue.
So,
I think that we have sort of the philosophical question of whether we treat cannabis differently from everything else. I think what Mitch was getting at was we should have adequate zoning and environmental regulations that protect the town in general. And if these places are going to violate them, we already have the rules in place. Just because these might be profitable and we might see new investment, I don't think we get involved with the economics of property investment. So I
But
think
it's-
that's beyond our scope.
But we have the right to, because it's a special thing.
But I think I would agree that the planning board, I mean, part of the goal of zoning and part of the goal of the language that we write or amend is to promote economic development, but there's also a character component of it. And I think if you have, you know, and there's a community component of it too, you know, there's a community to preserve that I think if you could, one could make an argument that if we force out all of, you know, I don't know, say all the boat places can no longer afford to be on Route 1. So I don't know enough about this at this point to say whether this would happen. But if all of a
Well,
sudden
Mr.
Freeport doesn't have any boat dealerships because we're growing too much weed, what,
Mr.
you know,
Mr.
are we
DeMillo's
still-
place would be just the right size.
Yeah, are we still Freeport? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
where do you go to buy a used boat? I have no idea.
I think one
Not
thing
Route 1
that
South.
makes us different, just generally speaking, we don't have a lot of manufacturing, processing, warehouse building. Brett can probably second this. If people come in and they want loading dock or warehouse space, we don't have a lot of it, so we'd probably have to see a lot of ground up. You know, we do have industrial zones and commercial zones that we do have a lot of vacant land. But I think for purposes of this conversation, you know, the council asked you to specifically look at the land use. So I'd really like some feedback from you on the buffers so that we can move the language forward. Are you good with 1,000, or do you want to shrink it down to 500, or is there something else you need us to provide you to make that decision? Secondly, you asked us to see the buffers with the child care centers. We have that before you, so do you want to consider that? And then I think, third, do you want to just look at this as its own thing in zoning districts, or are there things you want to relate it to? And if we allow X in a zone, you feel like this would be a compatible use and you want to look at that?
Yeah,
So we could pull that together.
That may be
for
the
you.
most important.
yeah.
So how does state law treat this now? They're calling it manufacturing and processing.
They call it it's the special type of manufacturing and processing. It's the cannabis definitions that they gave us before. So you have to think of it as its own special thing, nothing else that exists today. I think in your mind, if you make your own comparisons, if you're like, oh, well, this is like a boatyard or whatever.
Everything else is over here and they got their own little definition.
So the state has a definition for cultivation facilities and manufacturing and processing.
And they have a definition for retail, I assume.
Yes, mm-hmm.
And how does that,
Sorry, I'm having issues.
how does that work with federal law?
That's,
Is that the
You know.
bugaboo in the room? The states do it and the feds look the
So-
other way, or?
the thing with the federal law is that there is, I'm not the cannabis expert, but I think that, you know, Congress is looking to change that because so many states are adopting this. I mean, every couple of months, you know, you have a new state. So what's going to happen when the majority of the states legalize some form of, you know, marijuana, of cannabis use?
The way it stands now, the Department of Justice can choose what priorities they have to prosecute crime. So this is a crime, but they're not prosecuting it. Another administration could, you know, theoretically.
I mean,
That's the risk that the business takes.
well, yeah, I think we should really try to focus the conversation on what we're looking at right now.
I think
which is-
So if we could get some direction on.
We have a zone,
So-
we have two in town. We have a zone where they are. Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the state says is they can't have them 1,000 feet from schools. We talk-
500 or 1,000?
Well, you can go to
The ba-
500, but.
the Base starting point is 1,000, you can somehow request to go down to 500.
But they recommend 1,000. They're starting with 1,000.
So I would say
Okay.
we keep to 1,000. We had
Yep.
talked about last meeting, there is a lot of early childhood centers
Yep.
in Freeport, and it makes sense to include them as schools, which I continue to agree with. I think if we're talking about adding anything else, I mean, I do think of Wolf Neck Educational Center as like the same as this, any other educational facility that serves children from pre-K to grade 12. That vague notion, I mean, that seems to fit right in it. The
And
only,
it's in a residential zone, so it's irrelevant.
Yeah, the
It's
only-
not irrelevant, I'm sorry, no, I don't mean to jump in, just to clarify, because right now, we could allow this use.
Right.
There's, the state does.
Yes, that
Yeah,
gets
the
to the other
state
issue.
does not, create that requirement around residential uses, so just,
Yeah, I think
sorry.
the two big questions are, what do we want the buffers to be, and where do we want it?
Yes, I want to add to your buffer comment. There's not really like a searchable database for camps,
Yeah.
so that would be, I think,
but,
hard.
no, I'm not saying,
Like, for like Wolf's Neck, like, they don't show up in the DHHS.
I think she's saying is,
Daycare.
how would you,
I
there
don't
could be
know that we're
others
gonna-
just like it, not being treated
If
similarly.
they're not licensed, I
understand
don't
what
know that
she's
we're gonna
saying.
be able to easily find it.
Can you?
because
right.
I think not, what I would say for Wolf Neck is like, yes, they're a summer camp, but I guess they're an educational nonprofit. That they're not just doing summer camps, they're doing day programs with kids every day, they're doing events after school in the summer. Their mission is
What if there's another, could there be
educational.
another you don't
Let
know?
Anna
about?
finish.
Yes, sorry.
Their whole mission is education. So Wolf Neck, to me, seems like a little bit of broader use that I would consider.
So I think Mitch's point is, how do we apply it, if we wanted to, how do we apply it to that without creating a potential
That was my-
inequity? Yeah, is that fair?
Just draw a circle around it.
I mean, couldn't you say that South Portland said Boys and Girls Club? Like, couldn't you say Wolf
Let me
Neck?
get some additional clarification on how we can handle that, because I know like, now we have FCS and we have some different nonprofits and there's summer camp at Winslow Park, so now like, we're spiraling to all these things that we only know because we're sitting here.
We have the
Talking.
Y. I mean, we got a circle around the
The
YMCA.
Y is
Is
a
a
license, they have
license.
licensed childcare,
Or do they?
so they come up in the database, but let me flag it and see what we can bring
But-
back
so-
to you.
Because Freeport schools go there. I wonder if they have a license.
They
Anyways.
have anything on here
Yeah.
had either like a license or registration that we could somewhat easily find. Okay, so continuing with your buffer conversation to hear from.
Yeah, so I guess, Cecilia, are there other specific items that you're looking for direction on other than buffer and zones? And
Yes,
then-
and I do want to move on to parking too. So
Right,
it's buffers and what you consider sensitive uses or things that you want to add to that school definition. Whether you want to, and then moving on to, zoning is whether you think we should, which direction you want on zoning. Like, are we looking for comparable uses? I know last meeting, we talked about manufacturing zones. Do you think other uses such as warehousing or boat storage? Like, should we start to narrow down some zones based on these buffers? Or should we start looking at other uses that you think are comparable as candidates for, being on this new, allowable use on different zones?
I don't understand.
Yeah,
Lost.
sorry.
so you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're suggesting that we look to a use that might be comparable to this use and then tie the cannabis use to, so say, like, if manufacturing and processing is allowed in these zones, then we would also consider allowing cultivation in those zones.
That could be a path, if you find that, I just don't know, how are we going to go about selecting
Right.
this use?
Well, but isn't that exactly the point? I mean, it would seem to me you'd have to find some, let's just hypothesize. If manufacturing or industrial is allowed, this is allowed. That would be pending the buffer problem, but that we're comparing it to manufacturing and industrial, the only places it would be allowed is if manufacturing, you can adjust it, maybe that's not the right one.
I think that's a decent approach, personally. I think it's a decent approach, because I think the buildings could look the same. There could be some of the same considerations. I could imagine in manufacturing and processing that might produce odors or might produce other environmental impacts that need to be addressed. So we've got sort of architectural considerations that are similar, character issues that are similar, environmental issues that are similar. And then I think, speaking for me personally on the buffer issue, I would be in favor of leaving it at 1,000 feet And, because I do, you know, whatever, if I have an emotional and philosophical attachment or sort of predisposition to wanting a bigger buffer, then sue me, I do. But I think that, that's sort of my personal take, is that I would be in favor of a bigger buffer. I like all the areas that are circled. I think it would be interesting to see what we might be able to do to add a place like Wolf's Neck, an educational and nonprofit center, to the list, although it may be a moot point, as Mitch pointed out, because if it's in the rural residential and we're not considering adding it there, then it doesn't matter, but.
Well, I guess I would have to sue Sam because he wants a bigger buffer. I'm not sure, again, we should go beyond what the state requires.
I don't think so.
Be more
Yeah.
restrictive.
No, I think
unless
1,000
we're-
feet.
Unless we're identifying harms. and-
Right.
You just didn't want to go to the
Yeah, I'm
the
not.
smaller that we
Exactly.
might be able.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm saying that, yeah, I would be in favor of sticking with 1,000 feet. I don't think it needs to be bigger than that.
And
And then
the-
looking
my other comment is, why do we have to analogize to these other things? These things are inherently those things, right? You know, they're industrial, they're whatever regulations exist for any other manufacturing or cultivation business. Those regulations exist, so why do we have to analogize to them? Why don't we just assume that they are what they are, and they're gonna have to come in and pass those tests?
Because that's up for the 7 of you to weigh in on. Is that how you look at them? If that's how you look at them, then that's pretty easy.
I
We
don't-
do have those buffering standards in place and screening
Yeah.
and soften the building appearance, and you want to hold them up to the same standards that would do other manufacturing and processing. That's fine. That's
guess
the
it's philos-
feedback we were looking for from you.
Yeah, I think that.
Everyone has a different opinion as to what
Well,
they.
to me, philosophically, I don't see a reason to single cannabis out and make it different from everything else just because it's new and different or profitable or it gets people high or it's illegal federally. I mean, I don't think any of those things are reasons to change zoning laws or,
Right,
or
we're just looking
environmental
at the land
regulations.
use. Yep.
yeah.
That's my opinion.
What do you think, Rosemary? Well, you haven't heard from
I'm in agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if that's an efficient way to move I think also the part that we haven't really mentioned is hearing from the public. I think if that's a way to kind of move the ball so we hear from the public to get some of these ideas into language that we can present, I think that's a great next step, is to say, let's use the performance standards that are existing for these similar uses. Let's allow them in zones. Personally, I would probably go, C1, I2, C4, MDB, and MDA, and leave it at that. And so, I mean, I feel like I1 is just LL Bean, right? So.
Sorry, I stepped up for one second.
What's I2?
That's out near the LL Bean Order Fulfillment Center. Did you guys just say you're looking at it as manufacturing and processing? Is that what you said when I stepped out?
Using a similar.
For conversation point.
Yeah, similar performance
Industrial,
standards.
if that's different.
So we don't have like a industrial.
It's
like,
manufacturing.
Use, right? There's an industrial district,
Right.
but like, are there other uses that you would consider that facility? One thing that I see that they call the facilities look like warehouses. Would you consider a use, do you think warehousing
Yes.
and storage is a comparable use? Or any other types of use that you think would kind of fit the description? And I'm not sure, maybe Caroline is, if we have like greenhouse as a use. on
No, I was
the-
going to say, the only other one I can think of is agriculture.
What about breweries?
And that only would apply if it was outdoor or greenhouse. It wouldn't apply if it was a big.
This isn't designated agriculture, is it?
No.
No, it
The
can't
question
be-
is, if you allowed agriculture in a place, would you allow outdoor cultivation of this in that place?
What would you call it? Manufacturing, processing?
Well, no, we're trying to, so the goal here is to develop standards for this use. So there's a new use here. We are trying to figure out where do the performance standards for this new use that we're
Right,
developing,
but Mitch
where do they
is
come
saying,
from?
he compares it to like a greenhouse.
Right.
Which we would, if you're just doing agriculture, allow pretty much anywhere in Freeport.
And I was trying to suggest it's not a new use, it fits into existing definitions of uses. And
I
we don't have to
guess-
analogize.
Okay, so I guess this is what I would say. If I only hear Mitch saying agriculture, which would be allowed everywhere in Freeport, we'll take the manufacturing and processing approach. We'll come back. We'll show you where that would be permitted. We'll show you what standards kind of go along with that and any existing square footage limitations. So you can see that and how it relates to the canopy. So at the next meeting, we can narrow down what zones you're talking about, because then when you start talking about the specific zones, we're gonna need to start bringing people in and notifying of
Yep.
meetings and all that.
The production of beer and like the distillery,
Oh.
that falls under manufacturing processing?
We don't have anyone that falls under that, like a main beer company,
Yeah.
they would be artisan food and beverage, so they have like, it's small batch manufacturing, and then they have like a retail or sales component, which again, we're not doing
Right.
here. And a lot of the places, like some of the village, we wouldn't be able to do it because of the buffers. Commercial one district, but I think you're already gonna have manufacturing and processing down here.
But maybe we can like line them up.
Yeah, we could look.
Are there any other uses, like, do you think?
Can I just go back to agriculture for one more second? Did you say that if Olivia's wanted to grow lettuce commercially in big greenhouses, they could put it anywhere?
Let me look at Olivia's, like, I wasn't thinking big commercial operation, but I was thinking like if somebody wanted to put
If
it
somebody
in
wants to put a greenhouse in their backyard and grow a
yeah.
pot, I believe that's legal. I
I'd
mean,
have to look at like Olivia's, how
it's a
it
commercial use is the
how
issue.
they'd come in, because we don't have anything like that. I can look at that for you, but generally speaking, agriculture is pretty lenient in Freeport.
It seems like the other question is indoor versus outdoor.
Yes.
Which we haven't talked about. So for me personally, I would be in favor, at least initially, of limiting it to indoor only. But
That would
that's
solve that problem.
my.
odor problem.
That's my personal, and then I think it's the kind of thing where, you know, if we hear that a lot of people want to come into town and grow outdoors, and for some reason it's an issue, it becomes an issue, then maybe we,
Yeah, there's also the lighting.
Again, I would say let's identify the issue before
Right.
we restrict that more than we would restrict indoors. You know, I mean, I understand the concept that there could be odors that are more freely distributed, but we need some empirical data on that kind of thing.
I feel like we're not at that step yet, but I feel like I'd like to see the next step of determining, it sounds like we're gonna keep the buffer at 1,000, we're gonna look at manufacturing processing, and then maybe next time we talk about indoor versus outdoor.
Okay, I think that gives
That
us
help?
some good guidance, and I think will help us move along. I think you do have someone here that's been regularly watching cannabis. Do you want to take public comment or move on? Up to
sure,
you.
I
I don't know if they want to comment or anyone in
it's-
the room.
do we have anyone in the room who wishes to comment on this? No. Erin, online, please raise your virtual hand if
Do you have a virtual hand?
Oh.
So,
you see it go up.
okay, Erin, give us a minute.
Well, then,
Right.
can we open up?
It's not a
Erin,
public hearing, it's just
Oh.
public comment.
Erin, do you want to go ahead and comment?
Can you hear me okay?
We
Yes,
can.
thank you.
Okay, great. So my name is Aaron Pastor. I work with some property owners in the VC2 and VC3 district. And given what I've heard your action item to be, which I believe is to compare some of the uses across the zones, I really have no other comment other than to say I appreciate you're having a really thoughtful conversation about this. It's not always like this. I think do I understand the action item correctly for your next meeting?
Yeah,
You're
you,
essentially going to audit the uses for the different zones in Freeport, correct?
for manufacturing and processing, maybe
Warehouse.
brewery, warehouse, and then we're gonna dig a little into agriculture. I will say that looking at the map, the way they wanna buffer it, that the VC2 wouldn't allow it because there's buffer around daycare and a school. It would automatically be off the table. Is that what you said you were interested in?
VC2 and VC3.
Okay.
So VC3 is a potential outside of the buffer zone. Yeah, VC2 is essentially, it's hard to tell from the map with the line thickness, but it looks like VC2 is basically off the table for cultivation with the 1,000-foot buffer off schools and
In
daycare.
the daycare.
Understood. Thank you. I guess artisan food and beverage seems to apply, but I'm not an expert at this, so if you don't think it does, then
We can bring you some information next month. Again, we don't have a retail component, which artisan food, but we'll bring that information
it's
back to the planning board.
got it. Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Artisan food and beverage seems analogous to retail.
But they're making it too. All right, I'd like to move on to item 5, if that's okay. Everybody good?
Yep.
Initial discussion of possible amendments to section 514, off-street parking and loading of the Freeport zoning ordinance pertaining to the parking space requirement for residential uses in the VC1 zoning district. Caroline, you want to?
Well, I'll say it's late in the day to start a big conversation on parking, but we're gonna do it. So Freeport, I guess what we're gonna do is we're gonna start by just talking about parking in general in Freeport. Then we'll talk a little bit about the downtown and residential, and then Cecilia is gonna give you some best practice. So Freeport is pretty unique when it comes to parking. I hate when people use Freeport and the word mall in the same sentence, but I'm gonna do it. You know, people think, in a way, Freeport is kind of like a mall. You can come, you can park, and there's a whole bunch of stores and restaurants and places you can go. I think one of the big differences is you go to the main mall, and it's usually all one property owner. So they own this big building and they own all this parking. So you can see up on your screen, Freeport's pretty unique. This is a map that was in the vision plan. You had a handout that referenced it, but we have all these separate buildings that are shown in red, and we have all these little parking lots. One of the reasons that we're unique is that these are all individually owned parking lots. That being said, we have a couple owners that own multiple parking lots and quite a bit of parking, but again, they're usually on separate parcels owned by separate people. You know, visitors that come to Freeport, I don't think they ever think about it. They're just like, oh, you can go to Freeport, park everywhere. They have lots of town parking. Well, not really. We have a lot of shared parking. For the planning board members that have been on for a while, you've had significant conversations about this in both, I'm putting my mic on right now, in both 2016 and 2018. So quick high-level numbers. At last count, we have about 3,000 off-street parking spaces in the downtown village. Goes a little bit beyond VC1. It might go down West Street or a little bit north. And of those, sorry, did I say off-street? I meant to say off-street. Off-street parking, the town of Freeport owns about 150. The rest are owned by others. If you've ever watched the conversation on parking, you know that we've had different standards over the years, and there's been great debate over who owns what and what the requirement is. We have some property owners in Freeport that are grandfathered. They don't provide any parking, and they don't have to come into conformity unless there's a vacancy. So I come to Freeport, I park in this lot that you own all day, but then I go to everyone else's store. So there's been, you know, great debate on the way it's set up and who's requiring what and who's paying what. So the current standards, we incentivize shared parking. If you're gonna be part of shared parking, it means you're gonna have a parking lot. Anyone can come to Freeport for anything and they can park there, and you're not gonna sign it as such. If you do that and do shared parking, you have a lower parking requirement, which has been historically a good incentive. If you want to restrict your parking just to your business only, which we do have a few businesses that want to do that, they have lots right behind their store, you can do that, but you're going to have to provide your parking at a higher rate. You also have the ability to make a building or a business in Freeport, and if you don't have a parking lot, we have this leased parking pool. There's some people that have parking they don't need, so we have this lease parking pool. You can enter, say, you know, I have extra spaces, I want to put them out there for somebody else to lease. If somebody else can come to town, do a project, can't build a parking lot, but they can lease parking that another person owns. For many, many years, typically the only people that have had lease parking in the pool have been the town of Freeport and the Historical Society. There used to be more of a demand. We haven't seen as much of a demand in recent years. And I think it was 2018 or 2019, the planning board made significant changes to lower the parking requirement. So not only did they lower their parking requirement, X number of spaces per square foot, they also changed the way that they were calculating building areas. So people's parking requirements went down, and people could come in, property owners or business owners, and ask for parking recalculations. So I thought the next day my door would be, there'd be like a line out the door, and we were wrong. There wasn't a line out the door. They've kind of trickled in over time. So when you drive around town, you're like, wow, we have a lot of empty parking, or we have a lot of parking. We have a lot of parking on the face of the earth, but not all the parking that you see is any longer required to be there. I would say we probably have hundreds, I don't have an exact number, hundreds of parking spaces that are there because they're there, not because they're meeting a requirement. So fast forward, we just finished the downtown vision plan, which our community was very involved in. I think we had like 700 or 800 people just getting the regular emails and participating. And we heard a lot about what people want to see for the downtown village and what they want to do with parking, how we could repurpose parking, and what they want to see downtown. And so we heard a lot that, you know, people want to see housing downtown. They feel like we need to get people here so that there's people to go to the restaurants and go to the stores and access the public transportation that we have available. And we also heard that they want to repurpose parking lots. Now, repurposing parking lots for other uses is not a new concept to the planning board. It's something they talked about 2018, 2019, we kind of had a very similar conversation. And when the board looked at that before, there was a talk about looking at residential and changing some of the requirements. So fast forward to your crash course on parking, the vision work, we have had some interest. There's people that want to do residential housing downtown. I've had a couple people, we actually just got an application yesterday that will go to Project Review Board in June for some downtown housing, 60-something units. But the one thing I'm hearing from multiple people is your requirements are too high. When I further look at it, not only does our requirements seem high, which we'll get into all the details on that, but we also have this shared parking concept. Well, I don't know about you, but when I come home at the end of the day, especially if I have 3 kids and my groceries, I want to know that I can have a place to park. Well, it turns out I'm not the only one. You know, the developers are saying they want some parking on site, and people like me are going to want to get home and know that they have a spot on site. Again, shared, lower requirement, can't restrict it. So it can't be for like Sam's Apartments only or whatever. And then if you do non-shared, you get a higher requirement. So in your packet was today's parking requirement. I think there's 2 things that if we want to encourage residential development to happen downtown, and again, we're looking at this, I would say proactively, but we already have people interested. We know this is a problem. So 2 things I think that we need to look at. So you have on page 147, page 2 in your handout, you have a standard regarding on and off site. So in some districts you can use on and off site, but this entry statement where it says notwithstanding 514B, that goes to the requirements in the village for shared parking. So 2 things I think could make residential work better in the downtown. Would the planning board be willing to consider that residential uses, again, it's multifamily or mixed use really is what we're talking about here. Could we consider letting them use a combination of shared and not shared? Nobody has said to me, I want to see more parking, other than maybe a garage if we repurpose. Nobody has said we want more surface parking in Freeport. We have a lot of impervious area. It's in an urban impaired watershed. And Cecilia can tell you, because she's been the most recent counter of parking spaces, we have yet to see the parking lots full in recent time. So if we let residential projects use a combination of shared and not shared, they might have some on site that they could restrict for their residents, but then when all the stores are closed overnight, they could park in the existing shared parking lots. So that's one thing I think we want to look at. And then the second thing is just the residential requirement. And again, I'll have Cecilia kind of bring you up to speed on some current practices, but Freeport's current practice for shared parking for residential, it's under dwellings, it's on page 149 in the handout. We go by the number of bedrooms. That was a common practice in the past. I think, you know, it makes sense from an enforcement standpoint. I personally don't love it. We all know that once people leave with their certificate of occupancy, sometimes things change inside. You know, we like to think it always stays a 1-bedroom or whatever. In an apartment situation, it most likely would, but let's be realistic, it's not always the case. So right now we go off the number of bedrooms. I think that's one thing if you want to look at changing it. But if somebody comes in today and doesn't want to use shared parking, this is on page 150, dwellings in certain zones go off the bedrooms. Interestingly enough, it doesn't mention the village commercial. So if somebody comes in today and wants to do some multifamily housing downtown or mixed use, whether it be apartment, condos, et cetera, they would actually have to have 2 spaces per dwelling unit. So if they didn't use shared parking, let's just say they had 50 efficiency units, today they'd have to have 2 spaces per unit. Oh my God. So the question is, and we'll go through some of the recommendations before I have you weigh in, but the ultimate question is this something that the planning board feels like they want to proactively look at to come up with a more appropriate, or revisit the requirement for multifamily housing parking in the village? I don't think we'd get into single family at this point. We don't have much single family, new single families not permitted. So we're really talking about multiple family dwellings. The village plan had about 80 recommendations, and it was to revisit the parking and for residential to look at going to 0. That does give me a little bit of heartburn, to be honest. We've had recent conversations about concerns of the inequities because the town doesn't own much parking and it's privately owned, about some people not providing anything and then using other people's parking. So I don't really feel like we're at the point yet where 0 would be the right number for Freeport, but we can continue talking. Cecilia has some research. You have some public here tonight, or if you're like, that's enough for tonight, we can also carry it over to the next meeting.
I would like to hear from Cecilia, personally.
Okay.
Perfect. All right.
All right, so broad terms, nationally, best practices, it's kind of hard to find like a general statement on like a textbook, right? But in general, the planning field recommends, moving away from car dependency, and that includes the infrastructure that supports it, such as parking lots, so that we're not prioritizing vehicles over other land use needs. So whenever possible, cities usually, recommend eliminating or minimizing parkings. Parking has some negative effects. So it adds tremendously to the cost of housing production, especially in, downtown areas or cities, making sometimes building affordable housing like non-attainable. It contributes to stormwater runoff because it adds all that extra impervious surfaces, especially when it's, surface parking lot, which is the great vast majority of it. And also, it incentivizes having more parking, incentivizes automobile dependency and use, which allows, which fuels increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And also, it takes away from, it encourages people to walk less, which leads to a less healthy community. We live in a state that, doesn't quite allow mostly automobile independence. Although that was not the case until the 50s. We did have tremendous infrastructure of public transportation back in the 1800s. But keeping that in mind, I looked then for more examples in Maine towns specifically, and in the state of Vermont, which I think is a good match for us in terms of similar types of communities. So Vermont has, their state, what I would compare to their state planning agency, together with AARP, Congress for New Urbanism, and all the regional planning agencies. They came up with this really great zoning reform kind of guideline, which gives a lot of, including technical specifications for different types of village downtowns, and downtown zones. So their recommendation is to, in the long term, you want to eliminate parking requirements, but in the short term, as a short-term fix, the recommendation is to just have one space per unit, regardless of the number of bedrooms. That's the Vermont, what I would consider best practices for our, kind of rural planning. Then I looked at some other communities in Maine. So I looked at 5 of them, sort of. I looked at Belfast, Rockland, Yarmouth, Brunswick, and to some degree Westbrook. So Belfast and Rockland, they took the no parking requirements approach on specific areas of their, village downtowns. So they eliminated parking requirements in areas that don't particularly follow any kind of zone per se, but they mapped it out, like this area, doesn't need any parking. It looks like Brunswick has a similar provision, but the caveats, it seemed to be tied to like small lot sizes or small buildings, like less than 10,000 square feet, but I didn't call them to confirm. Yarmouth has their new character-based zoning district. Well, it's not that new. And they also have one dwelling per unit for all residential, regardless of bedrooms. So that's another one of our peers. And then apart from specific exemptions, Brunswick and Westbrook, which is kind of hard to tell apart because they have like 12 different contract zones, they also, like us, use, ties parking minimum requirements to number of bedrooms, although none of them are as high as ours for that one specific district. I think Brunswick also has multifamily, one bedroom, or efficiency, one per unit, but then 2 or more bedrooms is 2. Westbrook has one parking requirement for a unit for an efficiency, and 1.5 for 1 or 2 bedrooms, and 2 for 3 or more bedrooms. So it's a little lower. And then, finally, a lot of these towns that I looked at, like Freeport, they also have all the flexibility. So we're not really leading the way there, like in terms of being flexible with their other arrangements that can be met, like shared parking or, proximity to a garage. Yeah, and that's what I have to keep it brief. I did talk to the planner because I had to clarify Rocklands was kind of, I couldn't really tell what for sure under ordinance, so I called the planner. And he used to be the planner in the town of Keene in New Hampshire. And they also eliminated that parking requirements on their, little downtown. And he said a 140 unit went up, and that the market just kind of takes care of itself, and the developer thought that he needed 1.5. But he said it was very successful there, so. Yeah, and then I think Caroline already told you about the downtown vision, which is to eliminate it. So, if you have any questions, I'm here still.
Thank you,
Thank
Cecilia.
you,
That's
Caroline.
super helpful place to start. I do want to keep this fairly brief tonight, I think, just given the hour of it. But I do, so to put my cards on the table, so to speak, I feel bad that I would cause Caroline some heartburn for this, but I would be in favor of burning down the parking requirement because I think it is a market dictated sort of a situation in general. And I think, I don't know a huge amount about this, but I think there is some precedent for communities having success with this approach of saying, a developer understands better than any of us what sort of market they're after when they build a building, what sorts of folks might be moving into their units, and how far is the train station, how far is the breeze bus, how far is the parking garage away, so I think leaving some of those decisions up to developers may be in our best interest. At the very least, I would be in favor of lowering it. I think it's a big, I was on the board when, not in 2016, but for the second round of parking.
Yeah,
got-
2018,
2018,
we
yeah.
amended it, and then 2019, you looked at dropping
Yeah,
for the parking lot to 1 and 1.5.
yeah, and it was an interesting one. It was contentious and it's complicated just because the way that parking is dealt with in Freeport is there's a lot of players and it's very complicated. So it's a bit of a can of worms, but I think I would love to see the requirement lowered for all kinds of reasons, so.
Could I just ask a question of
Sure.
you, Carolyn, and what you, so it seems to me obvious we have enough parking, and that you wouldn't need any except to the extent that the developer thought they needed to sell with dedicated spaces.
Yeah, I think
Which would
Caroline's
be a-
example of coming home and wanting to be able to.
Right, so
Yeah.
that's, and I agree with you 100%. That the developer would know that better than us, they could provide it. But if they didn't provide it and everybody just used the service, there would be enough parking, it would be at night. The problem is would the landowners have an objection? That's the part I'm trying to figure out.
I would if I was a landowner.
And all of a sudden, there's cars every night, but you already are participating in a shared parking. You already know, in other words, why,
I think.
how could they even
Yeah,
fight it?
but
They could pull out of the shared.
But everybody downtown that's participating in shared parking is participating in shared parking. So if you change the rules now, so the residential guy comes in, he can use your parking, but he doesn't have to provide any to throw in the pool. Because
Yeah.
now all shared parking is people down, storefronts downtown that
Well,
participate in the pool or protect their own.
I think it would have to be a more holistic approach.
That's right,
Yeah.
that's right.
I don't think we would be able to just eliminate the parking requirement for
Residential.
for residential and not address the rest of the issue at the same time. I think you're right. That would
And-
be.
And the other thing I
problem.
think we have a problem with is, I go visit a friend of mine who lives up on Munjoy, and he's bought into a new condo unit a few years ago. So they have one parking space, there's 6 units in the building, they have 6 parking spaces. But on Munjoy Hill, they have parking on the street. So, his wife can put the car in one slot, he can park his other car out on the street. If we don't have any street parking, there has to be we live in Maine. People are gonna have to have a car. I don't care how much breeze we have, I don't care how many buses we have, or trains, or anything else.
Cars.
Everybody's gonna have a car, whether it's electric or gas or, a moped. You're gonna have to have a place to park a vehicle. Unless you can hire a chauffeur to come pick you up, and you step out the front door. So I think it's only responsible for me, responsible that we at least provide one parking space per unit. Now, if we want to reduce the residentials down to 1, I understand. I don't have any problem with that. But I think the landowner, the builder has the responsibility to provide the parking for the use he's building somewhere. Either he's got to go get some leased spaces or shared spaces or, something, because we've made everybody else in town pony up parking. And it is, and if it's a condo or anything, it's a commercial use in a way. If it's a rental, it's a commercial use. It might be a residential use, but it's still a money-making use.
Yeah, I think the other component here is a lot of the land area for development, and again, I don't know, I don't have statistics or actual data
Reduces
on this.
parking.
Is
But-
reducing, yes.
Right, so the land area that we're talking about developing is parking
Yes.
currently.
That's right.
And so by building on
double-
it, we take, it's kind of double,
Yeah.
double duty there. So
And
it's,
Just want to clarify something someone said about shared parking. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the past discussion, I don't think historically people haven't had a problem if you didn't have any parking. If you were part of shared parking, you're still paying for your parking and working in the program. I think a lot of the issues in the past have been some people have no requirement, so they're not paying anything and just using all the.
That's what it would be if we took it to
Yeah.
0.
But there's only a few people left that are sort of grandfathered in with no parking.
Yeah, I don't have a current count. There's a good.
there's a couple,
Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
couple,
and
but
there's-
not a lot, not a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I agree. I am not advocating for a situation in which we allow a 100-unit building to go in downtown and then they just park in everybody else's parking lots overnight. I don't think that would be,
It'd be an uproar.
yeah. And I don't think it would happen because I think the developers would probably be would have more foresight to if you can build your 100-unit, but what happens when your neighbor builds their 100-unit building and then all of a sudden the parking's gone because it's now
And
under.
they could put underground parking in, they
Yeah.
could put parking
So
on
I
the first
think-
floor.
Yeah, so
you
I
know.
used the example, like, there's lots back here on Depot Street that have been on the market. I'm like, that's where I park every day. So people are gonna have to shift their patterns as we see the redevelopment.
Yeah.
And we all feel like we have too much parking because we drive past certain lots and they're always empty until they're gone. And then, the
Right.
parking.
So I think we need to take a more holistic look at parking again, especially in light of interest in redeveloping parking, redeveloping parking,
Lots.
current parking into housing, and then following with the Freeport downtown vision plan, which I think suggests
So I just want to clarify, I've heard you say a couple of times you want to take a more holistic look. Like, you want to look at every parking requirement and how we're calculating it and change it for everybody? Or you just want to look incrementally right now at the residential, which is kind of what we had before you?
I think it's gonna be tough to look at. I understand that we're potentially opening a big can of worms, but I think
Big can of
I think we have to look at residential first and then try to think of some of the implications and, yeah.
So incrementally, would look at residential. And then we're going to have to look, which I think would lead to your next conversation,
Yeah,
the vision implementation and at the
right.
whole parking. You're not saying do all the parking.
I don't think we can do all the
Yeah.
parking all at once, but I think we're gonna have to, we're not gonna be able to just change the residential and then let everything else sit for
I mean,
years. Yeah.
It's taken, so granted, we had a pandemic, but we're looking at 4 years since you changed that parking requirement, and we haven't really even seen that,
Right.
anything happen, so.
I mean, you've never seen the parking lots get full.
No, we lowered the requirement, but we haven't seen any of the parking go away. Like, it's just
right,
sat
right,
there.
right,
So
right.
this will be the first time that, since they made that change in 18, that we're gonna see people coming in and wanting to redevelop them and parking go away. And then,
So you're saying the earlier changes are still kind of untested in a way?
yes, yep, exactly, because we all drove by and we're like, we have too much parking.
So do we have an idea, we must have somewhere, and I've asked this questions in years past when we did parking, sort of, who owns what, how many lots do we have? We must have some connection, even with the reduced requirements. What parking spaces are there, and what projects do they go to? And the town leases lots in the Magno lot, and who are they leased to, and how much is available there? Because every lot that's leased goes through the town hall for a piece of the action.
Yeah,
Still the
we,
process?
yes, we have a big, messy spreadsheet that was like, we've tried to maintain it, but we did like big counts starting in 2016. It says like Freeport Town Hall parking requirement, if we can tell, we can't always tell, was 25. They're meeting the requirement with 25 spaces here, or leasing 4, whatever it might be. The leasing pool, I'd have to look and see how many spaces. There's very few people leasing parking right now because no one's done anything that's needed parking. But yeah, we could look at the total count. It's not high, it's just the town and the historical society. All the other people that have extra parking have chosen to not put them in the parking pool.
So, but at some point, we need to sort of sit down. For me, it'd be nice to take a parking lot and say, what happens if you develop this lot? I mean, I know there's a parking lot down back for sale in that pool of buildings that's up for sale. And, is that gonna be developed does that have to be maintained as parking to be able to maintain the storefronts on Main Street, or,
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Not necessarily, like,
Yeah.
the burden of proof's on the applicant. So you might have come in at some point in time and got, approval for this building and your parking was down there.
Yeah.
Really? We don't care where it is. I don't care if it's in your lot over there or your lot over there.
Well, it had to
As long as you're-
be, years ago, it had to be 600 feet from the front door. That was the
Yeah,
requirement.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. It can be
Doesn't have to be
anywhere
anymore. Yeah, I see.
in the district, so as
Okay.
long as they're meeting it. So I would say, for somebody that has extra parking, like the town of Freeport, we have surplus parking, we have parking that's in the pool not being leased. Like, if we wanted to make some of our parking go away, it would be okay, because we still have surplus parking over, behind the gap. So it is a little bit interchangeable, where it used to not be, and you used to have employee on site and that type of thing.
But basically, there's an opportunity for reshuffling,
Oh,
it sounds
yes,
like,
yes.
right? Like if you have.
I think it's a worthwhile discussion.
Yeah.
What
But
do we
it
do?
seems to me this will be more important if developers do come and start using our parking lots. Then we will
They
need to
will.
consider this. Right now, we don't know. Do we know that? I mean,
I
Yeah,
think-
we have an application that just got submitted for some downtown housing.
Right, so I
It's
think, I mean, the
on-
immediate,
It's on Depot Street.
sort of biggest fire here, so to speak, is the applicant who's coming in and has an existing requirement of 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit.
Right, which anyone coming in today could meet it under their parking requirement. They could lease the parking. I think by us looking at this now, it's an incremental approach. It's something we heard people want.
Yep.
But this is the planning board taking this on as a vision priority,
Yep.
but looking at it as one, not reacting to an applicant request, just
Right.
looking at, if we want to make this happen, this is already identified as a barrier. It's been identified as a barrier in the past, so we want to look at it proactively to what we feel like universally would be appropriate for the downtown.
I think that's what we want to do.
So what happens next?
So we've heard from Sam, what are the thoughts from others on the requirement? Andy's for dropping it.
I'm for one per unit.
I think philosophically, I'm in favor of eliminating it. I'm not sure that's the best course of action immediately, I think. So I would be in favor of going to one.
Yeah. If you eliminate it, I don't know where they're gonna go, because, we don't really have on-street parking like you do in most places. You go up on Munjo Hill, you go to any city where there's on-street parking.
Right, I think you're assuming that the developers are taking care of themselves, or that would be my assumption in going to that.
They won't. They won't if they don't, if nobody, why would they? If there's excess parking and
Because
the
you
people
think
can
that-
park there at night, right there.
Yeah, but I think that would be assuming that the developer's building on with a really short time horizon. Well, yeah, maybe they would.
I think we just shouldn't get in the weeds. I think we should just, we
Yeah.
want to reduce it.
Yeah.
We're
Okay.
moving forward.
So are you feeling like you want us to bring you back a number for a public hearing next month and you notify everyone in the entire zone? Or you want to see a number plugged into the table
So when
to see the
Carol, when you
language?
say barrier, people come and say it's a barrier. What does that mean to them?
We know that it makes projects less financially viable and it's adding costs if they have to lease
So
or buy
so where's the sweet spot?
2 parking spaces.
That's
So
what we
is
gotta
one-
figure out.
So 2 is too many,
Yeah.
so if we drop it to 1, does that make it work?
I have talked to developers, 1 would make it work. You have people in the room that might want to comment. I think, developers that I've talked to feel like they would want to provide some level of parking on site.
I think if I went to buy a place, I'd want to know I had a place to park my
I
car.
mean, people love that they don't have to provide parking and they don't have to do
Of
it
course
in
they do,
other
because
areas,
it's
but
cheaper for the developer and he
think-
can maximize his profits.
1 could make it work, from what I've heard from.
Yeah, but I would think also that, if I were in the market to buy a big building and it didn't have parking, I'd be thinking really hard about what happens in 5 years or 10 years. Like, is my building gonna be significantly devalued?
So here's the next question. We live in Maine and we have to remove snow. So who's gonna clear the parking lots when they're shared parking and all the residences are parked in the parking lots at night when they're clearing snow? Mm-hmm. You start to get unintended consequences that, in Freeport now, most of the parking lots are empty at night.
Yeah, most aren't restricted for no overnight parking.
They are restricted?
No, most
they're
of them
not.
They're
aren't.
not restricted, but there is no overnight parking, so.
That's right.
yeah.
People
That's right.
aren't, yeah, people aren't there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you guys have things to, that you'd like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. Step up and share what we learned. I've met some of you, but my name is Brett Richardson. I'm the new Executive Director of the Freeport Economic Development Corporation. So good to be here, and first off, just want to say thank you for taking up this topic at this time. We know you have a full plate, a lot to work on, and if you look at that downtown vision, you think about the benefits that were presented in terms of the vitality that more folks living downtown can bring to the village. That was one of the important things that I took away. And it's funny listening to a gentleman tell a story that coming out of a meeting similar to this, later in the evening, 2 times he laid down in the middle of the street, in the middle of Route 1, and sat there for 2 minutes before a car came. And so you think about some of the dynamism that some of this downtown activity can bring, and that means a critical mass of people living downtown. I think one of the key data points I heard from the principal group is there's about 250 people living downtown now, and that the key sweet spot to really make a vibrant downtown is about 1,500 people living downtown. So that's one thing to think about in terms of a goal for the level of density that we could achieve here. And you guys are right on it. The parking requirements are sort of the first barrier to tackle there. I think 1 per space is a great step, but I think it's worth looking to push a little further than that. And to your point, we should do some more analysis on that and make sure that we're being thoughtful about it, so that we're looking at it, as Caroline said, holistically, right? What might work for one project the first project in might be great for that project, but it might not work for every project thereafter. And so the FEDC board has been thinking a lot about this, and I think we'd love to come back with you soon at the next meeting and share some further thoughts after gathering some more input from developers. But I think you guys are on the right track. Thanks a lot for taking it up tonight. And we'd love to continue to work with you to make sure that we have the right data to make good decisions.
Thank you, Brett. Anyone else?
I'm Paul Peck. I live in North Yarmouth. I'm looking at developing here in downtown, and I've developed other places. I'm not a big developer, but I've done some deals, mostly residential. And I think you're right, talking about developers knowing how to sell things and how to build things and how they analyze a project for parking. And I think you're right that no developer's going to develop something with zero parking unless maybe you're downtown in Portland. There's the highest building in Portland's going up now on Federal Street, Federal Street?
Yeah.
I think so.
Near the post office. And 17 stories, 220 units, zero parking. And the Peninsula has a zero parking requirement. That's the developer's prerogative. That would scare me as a developer, but I understand there's parking garages nearby, there's on-street parking, and it's the developer makes the decision. I'm going to provide, if I do a project here, I'm going to provide parking, at least one per unit. And I think that's, I don't feel comfortable selling, if it's a condominium, without a parking spot. It just would make me uncomfortable, and I wouldn't trust the market, especially in a suburban community. But having said that, with the train station, with the bus stops, with Uber, and with bicycles, it's a great community to have less parking. It's sort of waste to put two spaces for every unit, have big parking lots, stormwater, pollution, just valuable land to have 2 parking spaces per unit. I'm okay with 1. I guess I'd be better with 0. And then I'd do what I wanted for the project, but 1 would work. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline and/or Cecilia, do you guys have specific guidance that you don't have already that you'd like to?
No, I think it's more just hearing from you guys how you want to move the discussion forward. Do you?
Right. Do we want?
I mean, I think I'll let Cecilia come in. I'm comfortable with 1. I wouldn't want to go lower than 1 at this point in time. I'll let Cecilia weigh in if she feels differently given our Freeport situation, whether or not you want to just have another agenda item and another discussion. If we don't do like public notice and all that, I don't know that you'll really get people here. But if you want to go through it and try to hear from more people, I think Brett said he could do some research. We could just put it on as another discussion item.
I'd like to do that. It's so late right now, I feel like.
Yeah.
Hey, I
hard.
disclosed that it was a late
Yeah.
time for
Yeah.
having discussion.
Yeah, and I'd like to get more data
Yeah.
from experts.
Okay, so how about I put that on the next agenda first, since we had it last night, because it is a big conversation. I think, if we do some outreach, we might get people here to share their thoughts. And maybe what I'll do is give you some, just like rough draft ordinance language.
I think we should.
I was going to say, yeah, I think rough draft, for me personally, I would take the dwelling in the VC1, or the V1, VC2, VC3, VC4, basically this box on page 150, and just drop the whole thing to 1
Which page?
per unit, 1 per
Oh,
dwelling unit.
so basically, but that's single family as well, across the board for like any other zoning district.
Yeah, honestly, I would do it, but.
In just those VC1, VC2, VC3, VC4, and MDR2, just there.
Oh, right, sorry, yeah, not all other districts. Right, so I guess we would add VC1 to the list at the top, and then,
Yeah, I think
So
like
that
when
it's
we've been
one.
doing our research, like for single family, the standard is still 2.
right, yeah, sorry,
Okay.
I got a little ahead of myself there. Yep.
Multifamily in other zones.
Right.
Okay, and then as far as shared, not shared, do you have preference if they have a combination thereof? Andy had a hand, Mitch has a hand.
Go ahead. You
I was
start.
gonna say, I think the thing that we would want to keep in mind is incentivizing shared parking still.
Okay.
That, for me, I think we want to keep that incentive in place, that the shared parking requirement is lower than the, signed, whatever, Anna's parking only in this spot.
Okay,
So I guess that's, I'm not sure exactly how to treat that at this point.
well, I
but-
think, they could have parking on site, but then they'd have to have a higher requirement if they were gonna sign it. Or I guess they could just lease all their parking if they didn't want any of it
Could you go to like
on site.
0.75? I don't know.
No more parking in decimals.
Yeah, sorry.
That's right.
Parking spaces do not work well in decimals, I've learned. Okay, that's good feedback to look at. Any other feedback from the board?
I'd just like, it'd be nice if we could see, and maybe Russ, maybe the principal group made one, but sort of a nice big drawing of something we can pin up on the wall of the parking spaces we have, which ones are shared, sort of where they go, and what happens when we start unplugging those shared parking lots. How does that affect the downtown? Because, at some level, we're gonna reach an equilibrium where, we don't have the peak days we used to, but we still have,
We couldn't really very easily do that. It would be a big project. One thing I think we could pretty easily do, like we have that parking map.
yeah.
We could take downtown properties by ownership and pretty easily.
Yeah,
A lot of our parking lots are owned by the same few people.
yeah.
That would be a way that we could do it if you think that would help you.
But I'm just saying, when you start talking about residential and shared parking, I still get back to the point, the guys got a benefit for going to shared parking, but the residential developer, he gets all the benefit and provides no parking because we're allowing him to jump on somebody else's shared parking. So I
Right,
don't-
but if you have a requirement, if they use that shared parking, they're gonna be paying
They're
for
paying
it.
for it, yeah.
So they're gonna have to lease that parking.
That's right.
So that means we gotta have, so at some point, we reach a level where we've taken parking away
Right.
to build residential units.
Yeah.
So where are the lease parking's gonna come from? Because we're gonna, as we draw down the pool, we're not gonna be able to maintain the parking for the downtown. Because
So-
there's still a requirement for storefronts to have some parking, because that's the rule. And so,
But
at
I
some
think
point, you
that's
reach an
another-
equilibrium of, we can't take more parking away unless we reduce the parking requirements for the retail.
But that's another thing that the market is watching as well, because,
Well, not really, because we have requirements for retail.
right, but there's ownership. People own those lots, so they're not gonna sell them if there's,
There's one for sale now.
right, but
There's no
that's
economic
now.
benefit to the lots right now, except
If they're just sitting there and they're not leasing them.
if they're not leasing them.
Right,
and
Well,
they-
unless they're-
yeah, but we're far away from the
Unless they're
equilibrium.
required for their storefront.
Unless they're required for themselves.
And that's my question, is when do we reach the spot where,
Not for a long time is my sense. But I think we're outside of this discussion.
Okay,
for tonight.
we can pull some stuff on parking lot ownership pretty
We-
easily.
yeah,
I
we're
think
gonna
we
have
can
another
map that
discussion.
for
Let's
you.
But I
And then
think-
let me get you the leased parking number. Andy.
There were some maps that I remember from 2018. They may not be totally up to date, but I think somebody did compile a bunch of stuff for.
Yeah, I'll look. We might not have access to all of those anymore.
don't get me wrong, I'm not against reducing parking requirements. I just, and retail is not what it used to be.
Yeah.
So not so many people come to town as they used to. Now, I don't think it's gonna come
I
back
think
again.
that's why, part of the reason you wanted, I would advise you to take an incremental approach,
Yeah.
because we have this change we haven't seen anything happen with in 4 years, and now we're adding another change on it, so you don't want to go too fast and be back in the day where we have no parking or people that,
Right, people that can't
Have
find.
none.
Yeah. I would potentially move to. Do we have to do elections tonight, or could we
you
table
can
that
put
for-
elections off. I do, if you want to do it at the next meeting, I think that's fine. But I think we do need a little feedback, or you need to do some quick update on the implementation stuff.
for the vision?
Yeah,
downtown
because they
vision.
were looking for priorities.
Yes. So we, Is that, we would need a motion to table,
Yeah, someone would make a motion
Yeah.
to table elections.
unless people feel strongly about running elections. I don't know how long that takes, I've never done it, or I haven't done it in my memory.
I mean, you just have to have someone move to nominate chair person, someone second, then you'd vote, then you'd have someone to nominate vice chair, you'd have a second, you'd have a vote, and then you'd do secretary. You
I
could
move we
wait,
table anything that can be tabled.
you could wait for Robert to be here.
Second.
You could wait for a full board.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Do you mind making that a little more specific, Mitch, to
I
move item
move that we,
item 6?
We, yeah, table item 6 to the
Do I
next
hear a
meeting.
second?
Yes.
All in favor? All right, great. Item 6 has been tabled till next meeting. Item number 7, persons wishing to address the board on non-agenda items. That is me tonight, first at least. So there's been this downtown visioning process that I'm sure you all are aware of at some level now. We have this public draft of the downtown vision plan. There's a whole list of priorities for implementation that have come out of these studies and sort of renderings and all the public input that has been solicited by the principal group over the course of this process. If you go back to the relative end of this, starting on page 109, there is a spreadsheet that has, I don't know what, 80 or something items on it, where, sort of like an action plan that the various boards and committees and people in town can sort of, it's meant to be, I think, sort of a roadmap of how to achieve some of the goals laid out by this vision plan. There is a task force that has been formed to mostly, I think, facilitate communication between all of the different people who are working on these projects. So the task force doesn't really it doesn't meet to take action itself. It's more of a sort of a forum for people to bring each other into the loop on the projects that they're working on, so that they can then share resources and keep the whole thing moving efficiently, so you don't have multiple boards trying to do the same thing, or to take one possible example. So at this point, the task force is looking for priorities from each of the boards, and you'll see, I think, does this copy have the planning board?
No, because this is the copy recommended by principal.
Oh, okay, so this doesn't have the updates.
Maybe what you could do, there's a lot here, nobody wants to read it at this point in time. So I think
So,
just update them kind of what
yes.
you, and I know Rosemary has gone to some of the meetings, what we've kind of flagged for the thought on priorities for the planning board, understanding that one of them tonight, we just started the conversation on parking. We've already talked about some streamlining, so you guys already, like Sam said, some of these are more like, hey, we're already working on this, and then some of them could be new priorities, so if you want to identify those.
So the priorities the two top priorities that I have identified, and I'm obviously more than happy to take input from the board, are 2.4 and 2.5. So updating the zoning for downtown to align with a long-term vision, I think the thing that we've been talking about for a long time that fits neatly into that is updating the design review guidelines. That's a big project. We have funding somewhere in the street. We're thinking about funding.
We have funding in the operating budget, which will be voted on at the end of June. We have total planning board funding. I think I put in for 45. I think it got dropped to 40. So that's for anything we need planning services on. So I would say we wouldn't use it all on design standards, but the large number
chunk
is
of it.
really to get the design. And it would have to be done in the next fiscal year, starting July 1, and done by June 30 of the following year.
Okay. And that's one chunk of money? Or there's
That's
another
to
chunk?
write design standards.
That is to overhaul, design review, and the overlay. You have a separate chunk of money for the comprehensive plan.
Yep, okay.
Yep.
So that's 2.4, and I think, again, speaking personally, I think it's a good, a good priority, and one that we've heard a lot about over the last few years. We started to tackle it, I think, before the pandemic hit, and that kind of derailed the process. The next one, 2.5, streamline the permitting process. to make the development process quicker and more predictable for developers and others downtown. Like Caroline said, we've taken the first step tonight, or the first baby step maybe, toward lowering some barriers to development by looking at the parking requirements downtown. So those are sort of the two short-term, high-impact, achievable goals that I've identified as being priorities for the planning board. I know sewer connection fees were another thing that Rosemary had identified.
That's due, we had Leland come here, and then also the water. And I'm just like, this is infrastructure. We can't ask people to develop if we don't have a good infrastructure. So that's what I'm screaming about. I'm just like,
Right.
we have to do something about this. And if we can do something, that would be great. And I've heard there's TIF money and.
There's a lot of talk about
There's
like
a
the
lot of
sewer
talk,
connection
yes,
fees, yep.
Yes. And I understand now, I called Leland up to find out what is this sewage fee? And it makes sense because the sewer is not part of the municipality.
Right.
It's privately owned. So like, oh, okay, I get it. So that, and we can't change that. It would take an act of state legislature and all that. So that's why I'm emphasizing that one.
So the Vision Implementation Task Force is meeting once a month on the fourth Thursday. Anybody can come. I would say, given the lateness, Sam gave you an accurate update, as did Rosemary, but if you guys want to take time and look through the table, I'll just put a rolling agenda item on there for updates. So if you look at this and there's something, understanding you're going to be working on a comp plan and you have a bunch of other things already in the pipeline, but if there's something that jumps out and to you, like this needs to be a priority, then I would say
Fourth Thursday in the evening?
6 o'clock. They've been meeting on Zoom. It's been pretty short, like 6 to 7.
Yeah, like I said, not a lot of, it's not an actual policy discussion, it's an update and sort of a quick,
Connect to make sure stuff's
Yeah.
happening. I had one other thing, if you're, do you still want to talk about the implementation? Are we good?
I'm good, unless anybody has any
I
questions.
would ask that everybody saves their vision document that you had in your packet. We will be giving you all new ordinance binders. We have significant changes with the shoreland stuff, but save that vision. You're gonna, I think, keep needing it for a while. If you lose it, call us up. They're gonna be doing a final draft of any typos or edits, so when we get that, we'll give you a final version. But keep that, and then one of the things your discussion tonight was good at reminding me, I wanted to start putting a general agenda item so that we're checking in on whatever you did like last June, this June, like a check-in for stuff. Is that something you guys are okay with?
That'd be great.
That'd be great, yeah.
And I think if it's something like we can just talk about it super conceptually, be like, no complaints, move on. You can be like, oh, we really need to revisit that. Then we could put it on the next one. Are you guys okay with that?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Just work that into the system.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, any other non-agenda items?
Do you think we should start the meetings at 5:30? Because it seems like we've been going like to 8:30
Yeah.
every time, and to me, it's hard.
Past your bedtime.
Yeah, I don't know, is 5:30 to be too early for folks?
I think it could be hard to get working people here sometimes.
Then the question is, when do you have dinner?
I haven't had mine.
Me
We
either.
could shorten your agendas. We could not put so much. The other thing, which nobody likes, so I'm just gonna put it out there, is we could add a second meeting date sometimes.
I would almost, I mean, personally speaking, I would almost rather do that some months, maybe not every month, but like a 3-hour meeting. I mean, I guess we met today at 5. but-
We could.
Today was a
I would say
particular
if they're long, it would be better to have 2 meetings.
Yeah, we can look, I think definitely come fall when we're like diving into comp plan, we might wanna look at a 2-meeting approach to keep like
yeah. keep it to
maintenance
2
and
hours.
then,
Yeah,
And I also just feel like
Outline or
it's not
whatever.
fair to some agenda items, because I just
Yeah.
can't.
right.
Yep. I get like that too. I could start at 5:30. I don't know if
I think it's for the public hearing though,
It's
probably
6
for
is better,
folks,
yeah.
it's up to you guys.
I'd
I mean,
probably-
summer is always hard to get people to meetings.
Prefer
That's-
6.
I'd probably keep it at 6.
Yep,
personally.
6.
Okay.
All right.
But I think it's a good flag. It is tough to have long meetings and, yeah.
I just think it's great that we have new members and you guys are having such good discussion. So you're going on later, but it's good.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I would like to move to adjourn.
All in favor? Excellent.
I'd like to adjourn anything that could be adjourned.
Yes.
It's very good.
I feel like you're going to be quoted on that for years, Mitch.
Recording stopped.
I like the not changing.
I know, I didn't even realize I did that.
Oh, they're independently
This is
purchased,
also
yeah?
Freeport.
Oh, right. These are nice little stuff.
All right, good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Good night. Thank you. It does feel like we've been here forever, coming in at 5.
Oh, well, you work here too.
What time did I even get here today? Good night.
I know, Caroline, you might as well just sleep here, wake up.
Cecilia got here. She gets here at 7:30. I don't get here
Oh,
that
my
early.
gosh. Ooh,
But she'll come in late tomorrow.
I hope so.
Thank you, guys.